Today, I have 3 really good stories that all, in their own way, demonstrate that sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please steal the Follow Button's car and drive it to the nearest very busy intersection and simply park it right in the middle and then leave. Okay, let's get into our first story called A Bad Habit. On the night of September 11th, 1899, a 23-year-old student named Alice Knott sat in her bedroom in the Washington, D.C. boarding house where she lived, doing what she did every single night, which was to study. So Alice rarely left her room. She'd spent the last few months preparing to take this really important civil service exam, which she had to pass if she wanted to land the stable government job that she desperately wanted. But studying was not the only reason that Alice seemingly never went out. Alice was also sort of naturally a recluse, in part because she had a lot of health issues, like a weak heart and poor circulation, and she just generally got sick a lot. So being out in the world was really tiring for her and also sort of scary, and it was just easier and safer to stay inside. Now, it was getting late in the night, and there was some cold air coming in through her open bedroom window, and it was actually unusually cold outside tonight. And since she got sick pretty easily, she didn't want to risk this draft coming in, giving her a cold or something. So she set her work down for a moment, and she went up to close the window. And then on her way back to her desk, she smiled at the other very important reason that she spent so much time in her room: her beloved pet parrot, Polly. And Polly was sitting on his typical perch, one of the room's light fixtures, and as he saw Alice approaching, he got really excited and began squawking really loudly. Now, Alice knew that basically any minute now, she was very likely going to hear a loud knock at her door about the loud noise, because most of the people who lived in this boarding house with her hated Polly. And Polly, admittedly, was kind of a mean bird. Not only was he really loud, but he bit people and made really threatening noises and had some bad disruptive habits that pretty much drove everybody who lived in the building crazy. Like right now, Polly, in addition to squawking really loudly, was also pecking the metal frame of the light fixture that it was on, which not only made additional noise, but it also damaged the light fixture. Which, to most people in the building, they didn't care so much about the light fixture, but the landlord did. And so it was just this general consensus that Polly is sort of nasty and loud and also damages stuff. So nobody liked Polly. And they really told Alice that she needed to get rid of Polly, and soon, because he is a real problem. But Alice would not get rid of Polly. She loved Polly, and Polly loved Alice. He wasn't mean to Alice. He followed her around everywhere and was very sweet to her. And so Alice she felt very attached to this bird. In fact, in many ways, she viewed Polly as being sort of like her only family. The only reason she was in this boarding house to begin with is because her brother and both her parents had passed away. And so a lot of time, it was just Alice and Polly in this room together. And so it was just a very important relationship. It was like the only relationship that Alice really had. And so Alice just walked over to Polly, who was still squawking loudly and pecking at this light fixture. And she just told him to stop what he was doing. And he listened. He went completely quiet and, she pet him for a second. And then a moment later, she was back at her desk, back to studying. And for the next few hours, that's what she did, until her eyes got too tired to stay open, and she went to bed. Hours later, in the middle of the night, Alice suddenly stirred awake, and she sat up in her bed. And she had no idea what caused her to wake up. But what she did know is something just felt wrong. Her chest felt incredibly tight, and she actually felt kind of dizzy. And so she got out of bed, and she stumbled her way over to the door to get help. But she didn't get there. After taking only a few steps, her legs suddenly gave out from under her and she fell to the ground. The next day, just before 1 p.m., the landlord of the boarding house bustled around the kitchen, putting some lunch on the table. And then when he was done and all the food was laid out for his guests, he called out to the house to let everybody know that lunch was ready and to come on down. And a few moments later, all the guests appeared at the table, except for Alice. Now, the landlord immediately noticed this, and it did bother them. I mean, they hadn't seen Alice all morning. However, they did know that Alice typically stayed up late studying, so it wasn't all that unusual for her to sleep in. But even by her standards, 1 p.m. was very late, and so the landlord decided they would just go up to her room and make sure she was okay. And so the landlord went down the hallway to the last door, which was Alice's, and they knocked, but there was no answer. So after trying a few more times and still not getting an answer, they just reached down, turned the knob, it was unlocked, and they opened the door. And immediately, as soon as that door opened, the landlord began to gag. So there were a lot of things about Alice's pet parrot Polly that really concerned people. And Alice, who loved her bird and considered it the only thing saving her from total awful loneliness, sort of looked the other way when it came to all those concerns. However, there was one thing that Alice should not have ignored, and that was her parrot's drug problem. So in 1899, interior lighting inside of homes was almost exclusively open flames, and those flames were powered by gas. And it would turn out Polly regularly liked to inhale that gas. He would basically get high. When he was pecking at the light fixture, he wasn't doing it just to make noise or to damage it. He was doing it to turn the valve in order to suck on this gas until he basically passed out. Now, Alice did know Polly did this, but she would typically stop him while he was in the process of trying to get high and just kind of keep him from doing it. Or if after he had turned the valve and passed out, she would just move her parrot and then close the valve. Or she would keep her window open to ensure that the gas wouldn't get trapped in her room. But on this night, it was so cold outside, she shut the window, and then she fell asleep because she was so exhausted from all the studying, and it was after she had fallen asleep that Polly pecked the valve open, got high on the gas, passed out, and then the room continued to fill with this poisonous gas. So when the landlord opened up the door, the reason they gagged is they were hit by this surge of gas that had been trapped inside the room for hours. And then when they looked inside, they saw Alice's body lying on the ground by the bed, not moving, and then at the landlord's feet, flattened on the ground with their beak wedged under the crack at the bottom of the door, was the parrot. Alice would die from inhaling the gas, but the parrot survived because he was able to make his way over to the door and breathe in that fresh air. And so the parrot recovered and would continue to huff gas whenever it got the chance. Our next story is called The Canceled Vacation. Late one night in September of 1993, 43-year-old Linda Gowdy suddenly startled awake inside of her bed in her home in Stoneham, Massachusetts. She had just had this really horrible nightmare about how she was going to die. So in a few weeks, Linda and her boyfriend, whose name was Tim, were planning to go on a Caribbean cruise. And in Linda's dream that she just had, she had been on that vacation, and during that trip, she had basically seen herself dying in a car. And this dream, it was no ordinary dream. It had been so vivid, so awful, that even now, she knew she was awake, but her heart was still racing, she was still dripping sweat. It was like she couldn't fully escape from this nightmare. And as she's just kind of sitting there with these horrible thoughts in her mind, she began to realize that this was no ordinary dream. This was a premonition. So Linda was a doctor. She was an obstetrician and gynecologist who worked at a hospital in Stoneham, Massachusetts. And by all accounts, she was excellent at her job. Not just because she was smart and experienced, but also because she was just naturally intuitive and had this sort of like sixth sense when it came to her work. In a lot of cases, trusting her gut and going off of her intuition had actually saved the lives of her patients and their babies. And so she had sort of developed a reputation for being this way, and it had led to many patients actually traveling to her from all over the region to have their babies or just to see her in general, because it just sort of seemed like she was the person who could handle any problem, mostly because she would get ahead of it and sort of predict complications and treat them before they became complications. But this sixth sense that she had did not just pertain to work. She also would have, these sort of gut feelings or premonitions like the dream she had just had about her personal life. And almost always, her intuition on these things or her visions of the future would pan out to be right. So Linda knew that in order to literally protect herself, she needed to cancel her trip to the Caribbean. And even though she knew this was the right call, it didn't stop it from being hugely disappointing. She'd planned this whole trip, she'd been really looking forward to it, as was her boyfriend Tim, and also she sort of felt like this was an important trip for her relationship with Tim. She had been with Tim now for 4 years, and he too was a doctor, and they spent all their time together at the hospital. They both worked at the same hospital, but lately they'd been struggling and fighting a little bit more. Tim had sort of become pretty overprotective of her, like he was becoming sort of like controlling. And so it was just sort of exhausting dealing with their relationship issues. And this trip to the Caribbean, she saw as like this easy way to like get out of their normal lives and work on their issues, but in a happy sort of fun environment. It felt like they needed it for their relationship. But now Linda knew she would not only have to break the news to Tim that they were going to go ahead and cancel this trip, but also she would need to go find something else, some other way for her and Tim to reconcile, call it a different vacation or some other outing or something to like break the norm, which had become sort of toxic. So on this night, eventually Linda calmed down from the shock of waking up to this horrible nightmare, and she laid back down and she just told herself that she would figure it out in the morning. Like, this was obviously bad, but at least she wasn't gonna die in a car crash in the Caribbean. A few weeks later, on the night of September 30th, Linda stormed down the hallway of the hospital where she worked towards her office. Linda was fuming. So she should have been leaving for her trip to the Caribbean with Tim in just a few days, but she had gone ahead and canceled the cruise because of her dream, which Tim was very annoyed with her about. He'd been vocal about the fact that her reason for canceling this trip was ridiculous, and it had made things really tense between them, and it was already tense between them, so this is like doubly bad. And now, just a few minutes ago, they had actually run into each other in the hospital hallway because they both worked there together. And they had gotten into this huge fight about the cancellation of this trip, and other coworkers had actually overheard it. And so now Linda was not only mad, but also embarrassed, that other people saw her fighting. And so as soon as she got into her office, she just slammed the door behind her and sat down and tried to focus on her work, reviewing patient charts and other things like that, but she just couldn't. Now, Linda knew that canceling this trip was the right thing to do. She was sure that if she had gone to the Caribbean, she and maybe even Tim would have died in a car. Like, she knew that she was preventing that. But at the same time, she also just hated how this premonition was now further complicating her relationship. And so now Linda just told herself to calm down. She took a few deep breaths and told herself, you have other things that are coming up that will help distract her from the drama of her relationship and this trip. Like, she had a massage she had booked for herself on her day off tomorrow, and she also had her college reunion this weekend. 2 things she was definitely looking forward to that so far anyways, she had not had a premonition about, so she had not canceled. Finally, around 8:15 p.m., when Linda's shift finally came to an end and she had left the hospital to make her way home, she actually was in pretty good spirits, even though she had certainly not resolved things with Tim. They were still very much fighting. This Caribbean trip really had become a pain in both of their sides. Despite all that, Linda was determined that, she's not going to let this be just a constant drag on her life. She needs to just live her life and just go forward, and in time, things will sort themselves out. 4 days later, on the afternoon of Monday, October 4th, one of Linda's friends was driving towards the hospital where Linda worked. And this friend was very worried about Linda, since she hadn't heard from Linda since they spoke on the phone last Thursday, which in and of itself was not a particularly big deal, since they didn't speak every day. But this friend had also spoken to one of Linda's coworkers that morning, who was also worried about Linda, because Linda apparently didn't show up for work that morning, and the staff at the hospital were very worried, and they had even sent someone to Linda's house to check on her to make sure she was okay, but she wasn't home. And Linda, she rarely missed work, and if she did, she called in. And so to find out that she hadn't called in and nobody knew where she was, combined with the fact that this friend has not heard from her, like, the friend is thinking something's wrong here. And so they were going to the hospital to basically get together with their coworkers to just get to the bottom of this, to figure out what happened to Linda. But now, as the friend turned into the hospital's parking lot, she could immediately see that something was terribly wrong here. because the lot was crawling with police officers. They'd completely roped off the whole area, and then there was this one big group of people sort of standing over at the perimeter. And so when the friend pulled up and parked their car, she got out and she rushed over to this group to see what they were all looking at. And when she saw, she just gasped. It would turn out Linda's premonition was eerily accurate, but Linda had misinterpreted it. So on the previous Thursday, when she had left work after that long shift and she's looking forward to her massage the next day and the college reunion that weekend, she's trying not to think about the toxicity with her boyfriend Tim. She heads out, to head back home and just be done for the weekend. But she never makes it home. In fact, she never leaves the hospital grounds. Because shortly after leaving the hospital, Linda was attacked and strangled to death inside of her car. Linda had been convinced that the death in the car was going to take place in the Caribbean, and so avoid the Caribbean. What she didn't realize is that it had nothing to do with the Caribbean. It was simply that she was going to die in a car, and she did. Meaning the premonition she had was right. She did die in a car. The location was just wrong. So Linda's boyfriend, Tim Stryker, was the only suspect in her murder. He had no alibi, and he still went on that cruise to the Caribbean without Linda, right after her body was found. And he was later caught paying a witness to give the police false information about seeing Linda with another man at the time of her death. However, Tim was never officially charged with Linda's murder and denied all involvement. However, he was convicted of perjury and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, where he would die in 2011. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Ring. On a spring evening in 1705, a middle-aged man named John McCall sat by his wife's bedside in Lurgan, Ireland, crying so hard he could barely catch his breath. His wife, Marjorie, had unfortunately just passed away minutes ago from what appeared to be a horrible fever. So John was actually a doctor, and a few days ago, when his wife came down with this fever, even though John had not been able to actually diagnose what was causing her fever, what he did know is that the fever was just ravaging her body and it was going to kill her. And so over the next couple of days, John just had to watch in horror as his wife basically just shut down. And now, in some ways, her death was like a mercy, but it was still devastating for John. In part because he felt so helpless, like he's a doctor and he couldn't save his wife. But now, despite how unfair this whole thing seemed, John had to kind of pick up the pieces. I mean, his wife in many ways was like his whole world. They had kids, they had grandkids, they were only in their 50s, but much of those 50 years have been spent together. And so now it's like he was this lost soul. And so he just looked down at his wife and he just reached out and he grabbed her hand, the hand that he was so familiar with, and he squeezed it. And it was just limp. And it made it even more upsetting that she was really gone. And then he looked at her actual hand and he saw the beautiful gold wedding ring that he had saved all this money for, that they both had loved so much. Just seeing that ring on her finger, on that limp hand of hers, it really reinforced the finality of this moment. He couldn't believe this had happened, but it was real. His wife really was gone. And so now, as John continued to cry and squeeze his wife's hand and just sort of reflect on this horrible situation, he also, in tandem, knew that he had to start thinking about her funeral. He would have to plan it really quickly so they could bury her really quickly. So at this time in Ireland, it was traditional to hold a multi-day wake when somebody died so that friends and relatives could have time to pay their respects before the actual burial took place. But if somebody died from disease, like obviously John's wife had, something had caused the fever, he didn't know what, but it had to be some sort of disease. If that was the case, the wake was off the table, and the person was buried pretty much right away just to prevent the sickness from spreading further. But even though John knew this, he couldn't quite bring himself to face that reality, the idea that his wife would be in the ground as soon as tomorrow. But for right this second, John did not get up and, start making arrangements here. He just wanted to soak up the last few moments he had with his wife before she was in the ground. The following day, John stood beside his wife's casket as it was lowered into the ground at their local cemetery in front of a crowd of other mourners. Even though Marjorie, because of the disease factor, had not had a wake, John had still expected to spend this day focused primarily on grieving and thinking about all the things he loved about his wife. But instead, he found himself on this particular day very fixated on something else: his wife's wedding ring. So John really wanted his wife's wedding ring, just to have something to remind him of Marjorie, and he loved that ring. It was something that meant a lot to him. But pretty much right after Marjorie had died, as part of the decomposition process, her fingers had begun to swell really badly, and he could not remove the ring from his wife's finger. Nobody could. Other people tried, they couldn't do it. And so ultimately, the decision was made to just bury her with the ring. And so, of course, that in and of itself was sad for John. He really wanted that ring. But also, as John stood there watching her casket get lowered into the ground with this ring inside, he was worried that now her gravesite could potentially become a target for grave robbers. Now, grave robbing has been a thing as long as there have been graves, but it was especially common in Ireland in the early 1700s when the story took place, because the country at the time was experiencing widespread famine and poverty, and people were desperate. And so things like gold wedding rings inside of graves became things worth taking. And so John just felt like, am I always going to be worried that my wife's final resting place is going to at some point be disturbed? But, by the time Marjorie was actually buried that day and people had sort of moved on, as much as John really wished that ring wasn't in there, that he had it, there was nothing he could do. And so he decided he would just try to honor his wife's memory in other ways. That night, John was back in his home in front of the fire with his kids and his relatives all around him. And they were all crying and laughing and sharing their favorite memories of Marjorie. And then every time someone told a story about Marjorie, they would all lift their drinks and they would toast to her. Now, for John, this was very cathartic. This definitely was helping him grieve. But John was also just exhausted from his grief, and also the whirlwind of the last few days and just how wretched they had been. And so even though people definitely were intending to stay up for quite a while here, John, at some point in a lull in all the stories and laughter and crying, he stood up to head off to bed. But as soon as he did, as he began leaving the crowd and they're all kind of watching him, he heard a knock at the door. And so John sighed and headed towards the door, assuming it had to be one or more mourners who want to come in and pay their respects and just sort of be there for him. But when he opened the door, it was not a mourner. It was something else entirely. And when he saw what was out there, it made his breath catch in his chest, and then suddenly he felt this shooting pain rocketing through his chest. Then he felt his legs buckle underneath him, and before he knew it, he was falling to the ground. It would turn out John had been right to be worried about the fact that his wife was buried with her wedding ring. Because not long after she was laid to rest, word had gotten out that there was this ring inside of her grave, and grave robbers, they dug her up. But just like John and everybody else who tried, the grave robbers also could not get the ring to come off of Marjorie's swollen finger. So they had to cut off her finger to get the ring. But when they did that, a very unexpected thing happened. Marjorie sat up and started screaming. So even though John was a doctor, he had been wrong when he thought she had died. He wasn't the only one. Lots of people thought she had died. However, nobody caught it, and they were so quick to bury her because they were fearful of whatever had caused her fever, that disease, that it would continue to spread, that they buried her while she was alive. Just nobody knew. And then those grave robbers, when they cut off her finger, well, the pain of having her finger lopped off basically jolted her out of this catatonic state she was in, and she sat up and she was fully alive again. But when Marjorie basically stumbled from the cemetery, fresh from her grave, back to her home to tell her husband that, hey, I'm still here, when John opened the door and he saw his wife standing there covered in dirt and missing a finger and looking horrible, he was so shocked and so scared that he had a heart attack, and he actually died. John was buried in the same plot that Marjorie had just been dug out of. Marjorie, despite what happened to her, she went on to live for many more years, just without her ring finger. And then when she finally did die, she was buried in the same cemetery and was given a headstone with the inscription, "Lived once, buried twice." That headstone is still at Shankill Cemetery in Ireland today. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Locascio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Story editing by Evan Allen and by Luke Baratz. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Locascio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. On May 13, 2015, a police officer in Michigan named Gary Wilson rushed to the scene of a double suicide. When he got there, he went inside the dark home and made his way to the bedroom where the two bodies were located. Wilson took a look at one of the bodies, and then he turned around to check on the other, and when he did, he immediately noticed something about the second body that was so surprising the officer nearly fainted from shock. However, this absolutely wild discovery was only one small aspect of one of the most bizarre cases this officer would ever investigate. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're at the gas station with the Amazon Music follow button, kindly offer to fill up their car with gas. But instead of filling up their gas tank with gasoline, fill up the actual inside of their car with gasoline. Okay, let's get into today's story. On May 9, 2015, 46-year-old Marty Durham was sitting on his bed in Sand Lake, Michigan, and he couldn't stop laughing. Because his pet African gray parrot, named Bud, was perched in his cage near the bed, and the bird was just swearing and cussing up a storm. And Marty thought it was hysterical. African gray parrots are considered to be some of the very best mimics. They can imitate specific voices, and they can also have vocabularies of close to 1,000 words. And Bud's vocabulary clearly included more than a few swear words. As his parrot continued to cuss away, Marty began to hear voices coming from the living room. So he told Bud he'd see him later. Then Marty placed his hands firmly on the bed, and he slowly pushed himself up to his feet. Immediately, Marty felt a twinge of pain shoot through his legs, but he shook it off. About 20 years earlier, Marty had been in this terrible car accident, and he'd suffered very serious injuries. Marty had eventually recovered, but he'd had to battle pain in his legs and back ever since. And that pain had actually only gotten worse over time as Marty got older, and so now Marty had to actually wear a brace on one of his legs just to help him walk. Marty made his way from the bedroom down a hallway towards the living room. Marty was tall with short brown hair and a mustache, and he was wearing a t-shirt and denim shorts. Marty stepped into the living room, and he saw his wife Glenna was speaking with his adult son who had stopped by to visit. Marty had 3 children from a previous marriage, and all of them were grown up and out of the house. But they still came by fairly often to spend time with their dad and their stepmom. Marty gave his son a hug, and then he sat down on the couch next to Glenna. The living room was almost like a shrine to Marty's favorite pastime, which was hunting. There were buckheads mounted on the wall as trophies, and the brown leather couch was draped with all these blankets that had images of deer on them. Marty's son asked how Bud the parrot was doing, and Marty just started laughing again, and then he told his son about how Bud was just ranting in the bedroom. Marty and his ex-wife, Christina, had had buds since the kids were young, so Marty's son had grown up with this bird. After chatting for a bit, Marty asked his son and his wife if they wanted to go outside, and they said yes. So Glenna stood up and she helped Marty get to his feet. Glenna, like Marty, was 46 years old, and she had long brown hair and she wore glasses. Glenna unlocked the back door, and then the three of them stepped out onto the new wooden deck that Marty and Glenna had just put in. It was an absolutely perfect day, about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Marty breathed in the fresh air, and he felt an utter sense of calm come over him. Being outside was like freedom to Marty. There was just nothing like it as far as he was concerned. And that was actually a huge reason why he'd bought the house where he and Glenna now lived. Years after Marty's terrible car accident, he had received some insurance money from the crash, and he had used that money to help him buy his blue wooden house in a very secluded area in the small rural town of Sand Lake. Marty loved the house itself, but it was actually the land that the house sat on that made him happier than almost anything else. From the deck, Marty looked out across the huge backyard at all the surrounding woods, and he couldn't help but think about his next hunting trip. If it were up to him, he'd go hunting or fishing every single day. But he knew he had to take it easy sometimes to give his legs a rest. Marty, Glenna, and Marty's son spent a good part of the day just sitting outside on the deck and talking. And then at some point, Marty's son said he needed to get home, so Marty stood up and he gave his son another hug, and then told him he'd see him soon. Then Marty's son said bye and left the deck and walked around the house towards the front where his car was, and Marty and Glenna just stayed out back on the deck. And hours later, Marty and Glenna were still outside, and they watched the sky turn gold and red as the sun began to set. Marty knew there was no such thing as a perfect life, and he had been through enough to know that everything could change in an instant. But there were times, like right now, when he just couldn't imagine being in a better place than he was. He had 3 kids that he loved dearly, and he was a grandfather with another grandchild on the way. He had this amazing house on this great land, and he was married to someone who he genuinely loved, Glenna. Marty and Glenna had actually first met when they were teenagers, and they had been attracted to each other right away. They began dating, and for a while, they spent as much time together as they could. Both Marty and Glenna had a shared love of nature, so they were always out and about walking around in the forest and going on long walks together, and they also spent a lot of time together hanging out with friends in town. But then, to the shock of a lot of their friends, Marty and Glenna had broken up and gone their separate ways. And not long after they had broken up, they both got married to other people. Marty married Christina, his first wife, and they had 3 kids together and their pet parrot Bud, and for years they had a pretty happy life together. And Glenna had gotten married and had kids of her own too. After Marty's car accident, Christina, his first wife, helped him a lot during his recovery. But their relationship started to become strained over time, and they ended up getting divorced about 5 years after Marty's wreck. Then Marty had moved out, bought the blue wooden house on the amazing land, and continued to raise his kids. It turned out that Glenna had also gotten a divorce, and Marty and Glenna, who had almost been inseparable as teenagers, ultimately reconnected and rekindled their relationship. Glenna had moved back in with Marty back in 2001, and a few years later, they had gotten married. Some of their friends thought it seemed like no time had passed at all, like somehow Marty and Glenna were the exact same together as they had been when they were kids. They could still just sit down and talk for hours at a time and not get bored, and they still love spending loads of time outdoors together. On the backyard deck, Marty and Glenna watched the last rays of sun disappear and then went inside the house. Glenna went to the kitchen to get dinner ready, and Marty headed to the bedroom. On the way to the bedroom, he checked the front door to make sure it was locked. Marty had always been someone who was very cautious, and so he liked to keep all the doors locked and deadbolted even when he and Glenna were home during the day. Some of that precaution was really just because that was Marty's nature, but it was also because Marty knew he kept several hunting weapons and handguns in the house, so if someone did come into the home, he knew things could turn violent very quickly. And even though they did live in a pretty secluded area, there was a road not too far from them, so people did pass by them, and Marty just didn't want to take any chances. Marty walked into his bedroom, and he saw Bud the parrot bobbing back and forth on his perch. Then Marty stepped into the bathroom, and he took a prescription pain pill out of a bottle on the counter, and he washed the pill down with water from the sink. Marty took a deep breath, went back into the bedroom, and sat down on the bed. Marty didn't usually take as many pain pills as were prescribed to him for a day, But sometimes in the evening, his leg pain got a lot worse and the pills really helped. But even with the big inconvenience of chronic pain and some of the other issues his car accident had caused over the years, Marty still tried hard not to dwell on the past. And as he sat there waiting for his pain meds to kick in, he smiled because he was thankful for what he had. A great family, a house he loved, and a foul-mouthed talking bird who could always make him laugh. On the evening of May 11th, 2015, so 2 days after Marty's son had come to visit, the smell of Italian food wafted through Marty and Glenna's house. Marty walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. Then Glenna came over and put down a plate of spaghetti and garlic bread in front of him, and then she also put another plate down for herself, and she sat down across from Marty. As they ate dinner, Marty talked about wanting to plan a trip with some friends to go hunting wild boar and ram. Those types of hunting trips were far more complicated to coordinate than deer hunting trips in this area. And the pain in Marty's legs often made it very difficult for him to drive, which might make the trip even more complicated. Still, Marty was excited to try to put the trip together, and Glenna didn't have any objections. She often drove Marty to his doctor's appointments or other important places he had to go, and so they could figure something out for the hunting trip if they needed to. After dinner, Glenna picked up the plates and left them on the counter in the kitchen. Then Marty and Glenna went to the living room and watched TV for a couple of hours. Finally, just after midnight, Marty was tired, so he said goodnight to Glenna, he got up, and he went to their bedroom. Glenna told him she was going to stay up a bit longer and look at her phone. Once he was in the bedroom, Marty undressed and got into bed. He then said goodnight to Bud the parrot, then flipped off the light and went to sleep. But hours later, at about 5 a.m., Marty suddenly woke up feeling really startled. He heard his closet door open, and then he heard shouting. And then Bud the parrot began squawking from his perch, and Marty was just so confused he had no idea what was going on. But then Marty's eyes focused in the low light, and he saw there was someone standing in his bedroom just a few feet away. And so Marty shouted at this person in the room, and the bird squawked even louder. Over 24 hours later, so on May 13th, Marty and Glenna's neighbor watched smoke rising into the air not far from her house. Then the neighbor heard the screams of sirens and saw a fire truck barreling down her road. The neighbor was very worried about Marty and Glenna. She had texted both of them several times the day before, but neither of them had responded, and this just was not like them. The neighbor and Marty and Glenna were all very good friends, and they talked and texted all the time, and they were always very quick to get back to each other. The neighbor had also gone by Marty and Glenna's house the day before, but the couple hadn't been home. And so now that this neighbor is seeing fire trucks come bombing down her road and she's seeing smoke in the air, naturally she worried that the fire might be coming from Marty and Glenna's house. And so the neighbor just ran outside and began running down the street towards Marty and Glenna's house. And as she ran down the road, she saw the fire trucks up ahead coming to a stop and the firefighters jumping down off the truck to get the hoses ready to put out the fire. But as the neighbor went down the road, she realized that it was actually a small fire that was not on Marty and Glenna's property. Their house was not on fire. And so the neighbor was totally relieved, but since the neighbor was already outside, they decided they would just go to Marty and Glenna's house to see if maybe they were home now. But when the neighbor crossed Marty and Glenna's huge front yard and arrived on their front porch and knocked on the door, there was no answer. The neighbor thought about leaving, but she just couldn't shake this feeling that something was wrong with Marty and Glenna. So the neighbor just reached down and grabbed the doorknob and tried to turn it, and shockingly, the doorknob turned because the door was unlocked. And this really frightened the neighbor. She knew how much Marty liked to keep all the doors locked and deadbolted basically all the time. The neighbor cautiously opened up the door and then stepped inside the house, and then began calling out to Marty and Glenna. But the house was silent. So the neighbor turned the corner and walked into the living room, and when she did, it was like her heart skipped a beat, because the place was a total wreck. A lamp had been tipped over and knocked off a table, and there were papers and trash scattered all across the floor. Then the neighbor heard the parrot, Bud, begin to squawk in Marty and Glenna's bedroom. So the neighbor walked down the hallway to the bedroom, and they stepped inside, and Bud, who was in the back cage, squawked louder and louder, and the neighbor just kind of looked around the bedroom, and at first it just looked like a normal bedroom, except for the fact that all the blankets from the bed were basically piled on the ground right in front of the door. So the neighbor stepped over those blankets and began walking towards the back of the bedroom to see what was next to the bed. And when she saw what was on the ground next to the bed, the neighbor just froze. Because there, next to the bed on the ground, was Marty, in his underwear, with his face and chest covered in blood. The neighbor was totally shocked, and they turned to run out of the room, but as soon as she turned, she looked down and realized now from her vantage point, she could see that actually Glenna was inside of those blankets that she had stepped over when she first came in. And now the neighbor was seeing Glenna's face, and Glenna's skin was pale and her hair was matted down with blood, and the neighbor just screamed and jumped over Glenna and ran out of that house and then screamed for all the firefighters who were right nearby putting out that small fire. And one of the firefighters saw the neighbor and rushed over to her, and after she explained what she just found in her friend's house, the firefighter motioned for two of the first responders, and then the three of them ran into Marty and Glenna's house. And then as soon as they walked into the bedroom and actually saw Marty and Glenna on the ground, the first responders knew they were dealing with a crime scene. And so one of the firefighters called police dispatch, and he said they had just found two dead bodies and they needed police on the scene ASAP. About 2 hours later, at around 5:30 p.m., Sergeant Gary Wilson of the Michigan State Police arrived in front of Marty and Glenna's house. Sergeant Wilson saw an ambulance and a fire truck nearby, and there were multiple firefighters, paramedics, and state troopers standing outside the house. Sergeant Wilson got out of his car and walked over to one of the firefighters. The firefighter explained that they had to put out a small fire in the area, but then this woman had come running out of Marty and Glenna's house screaming for help. The firefighter said, once they had seen what was inside of the house, members of the fire department and other first responders were instructed to stay outside until police arrived, because it was believed the house was now a crime scene. Now, Sergeant Wilson had been told all of this already by police dispatch. He also had been told that he was very likely responding to a double suicide. But when Wilson approached the house, one of the state troopers went over to meet him, and that trooper believed there was a strong chance they were actually dealing with a double homicide, not double suicide. Wilson followed the trooper inside the house to the bedroom. And when Wilson saw Marty on the floor, he was also pretty sure the man had not killed himself. Marty had multiple gunshot wounds, and there was no weapon nearby. Then Wilson stepped over to the pile of blankets on the floor to get a better look at Glenna's body, but when he crouched down on one knee and leaned in closer to her, he heard a loud gasp. Glenna's eyes opened, and then she screamed. Wilson stood and stumbled back a few steps. He was in shock. But he quickly called for a paramedic and kept shouting over and over again that she's alive, guys, get in here. Paramedics rushed into the bedroom and began working to get Glenna oxygen. Then they put her on a stretcher, wheeled her outside, and got her into the ambulance. As the ambulance sped away to the hospital, Wilson stood in Glenna and Marty's bedroom, trying to recover from the shock of what had just happened. And then once he'd caught his breath and calmed down, Sergeant Wilson called in that one of the victims, who everybody thought was dead, was actually alive. And also, Wilson said he believed they were not dealing with a suicide, but a murder, and so he needed a forensics team. Not long after Glenna woke up in the bedroom, a state forensics team arrived at the property and began doing a thorough sweep. In the bedroom, not far from Marty's body, they found several bullet casings. They also found a key to Marty's gun safe on the floor, and they located the safe in the closet. So Wilson's first thought was that someone who knew that Marty kept guns in a safe had taken the key, gotten a weapon out of the safe, and then using that weapon, they had killed Marty and attempted to kill Glenna. And the idea that the killer was someone the couple knew made sense because there was no sign of forced entry in the house. Now, Marty and Glenna's neighbor had found the front door unlocked, so it was possible that maybe Marty or Glenna had unknowingly welcomed the killer into their home. But the forensics team also found something very strange in the bedroom. Marty had died while clutching a patch of hair in his right hand, so they would need to run DNA tests to see if the hair matched Marty's or if it belonged to someone else, like maybe his killer. Sergeant Wilson heard someone calling to him from the living room, so he stepped out of the bedroom and headed that way. When he got there, he saw a forensics officer on the ground bagging a piece of evidence. The officer had found a .22 caliber Ruger revolver underneath one of the living room chairs. Sergeant Wilson knew they would have to wait for ballistics testing to see if this revolver really was the murder weapon, but Wilson already had a strong feeling that very likely this was the murder weapon. And he was almost positive that that gun must have come out of Marty's safe. After several hours in the house, Wilson felt like he still had a lot of questions to answer, so he called the hospital in hopes that Glenna was now in stable condition and able to talk to him about who had shot her and her husband. But doctors would tell him that Glenna, unfortunately, was still very much recovering from her wound and not really in a good position to talk to him, at least not yet. So Sergeant Wilson decided if he couldn't talk to Marty's wife, then he would just start his investigation with other members of Marty's family, his kids. On May 14th, so a day after Marty's body had been discovered, Marty's 2 sons and his daughter climbed under the crime scene tape outside of Marty's house and approached the front door. They all stood at the door, still in total shock. How could this place that had made them so happy over the years now be just a violent crime scene? It just didn't make sense to them. The siblings entered the house. They were there to pick up Bud the parrot so they could bring him back to their mother, Marty's ex-wife, Christina. But before they actually made it to the bedroom to grab Bud, they were all stunned by the mess in the living room. Their dad and their stepmother had always kept the house very neat and tidy, so it didn't even look like the same place. Then something caught their attention. A large manila envelope was on the living room floor amongst the mess, and so one of Marty's sons crouched down and opened the envelope and looked inside. And he showed the contents to his brother and sister, and they all agreed this was something they should hold on to. Then they went to the bedroom to get Bud the parrot. Soon after they had left, the siblings brought Bud to their mother's house. Then they decided to show the police the manila envelope they had found. Later that day, after Marty's children had contacted the police, they were brought into the local station to be interviewed. Sergeant Wilson had already planned to begin his investigation with Marty's kids, but now that they had this manila envelope, he was so eager to speak with them. Wilson knew there was a good chance that he was simply dealing with 3 grief-stricken young people who had just lost their father, but he still could not eliminate any of Marty's kids as potential suspects, at least not yet. So Wilson first led Marty's oldest son, Justin, into a small office at the station. Wilson wanted to meet with each of Marty's kids separately. He believed that if one of the kids had information about the case, they were more likely to share it if each of them was on their own. In the office, Wilson told Justin they were not accusing him of anything. They just wanted to talk to him to see if he had any information that could help with their investigation. And Justin was very calm and seemed eager to cooperate. Wilson asked Justin if he knew about any enemies his father might have, or if his dad had recently had a falling out with any of his friends. Justin said he couldn't think of anyone. He said his dad was really close with his neighbors and his hunting buddies, and they all seemed to get along really well. But then, Justin got a look on his face like he just remembered something. He looked up at Wilson and told him that there were a bunch of people who knew his father had a big supply of prescription pain medication inside of his house. When Wilson heard this, he immediately sat back in his chair and just thought for a second. At the time, the opioid epidemic in the United States was near its height. Prescription painkillers, like the ones Marty took, were in very high demand, and addicts had been known to commit terrible crimes to get a hold of these drugs. So Sergeant Wilson started to wonder if someone who knew Marty had killed him and attempted to kill his wife simply to get a hold of Marty's pills. After they talked a bit longer, Wilson thanked Justin for his cooperation and told him police would be in touch if they needed anything else. Later that day, Wilson and other investigators met with Marty's 2 other kids, and their version of events surrounding their visit to their dad and stepmother's house and the manila envelope they found in the living room were all basically the same. So, in the following days, investigators met with other people who were close to Marty to see if they had any information they might be able to add. And one of the people investigators spoke to said she knew that Marty's guns were not the only things that he and Glenna kept locked up in their safe. They also kept a couple of $1,000s in cash locked up. But, as Sergeant Wilson knew, no cash had been found inside of that safe. And so suddenly, the information about this missing money and the information Marty's son had given about Marty's pills started to paint a picture of what happened for investigators. And so now their theory was that someone Marty and Glenna knew had possibly come to their house with the intention of robbing them of their cash and their prescription drugs. So Wilson wanted to meet with anyone who had known about the safe in the couple's house to see if he could track down the missing money and Marty and Glenna's attacker. It had only been about a week since the attack, but Sergeant Wilson and the rest of his team were already getting frustrated. They felt like they had all these puzzle pieces right in front of them, but none of the pieces seemed to connect. There was the missing money from the safe, there was that manila envelope that Marty's kids had found in the living room, and there was the potential that somebody had wanted to steal Marty's prescription pain pills. But as investigators spoke to just about anybody who had any connection to Marty and Glenna, they couldn't find any evidence that sort of pointed to a particular person, a primary suspect, and they still had no leads on the missing money. Wilson had desperately hoped that Glenna would be able to provide the missing pieces that would make the puzzle kind of come together, but she was still recovering in the hospital, and so for now, an interview was still not possible. But when the investigation began to look like it was genuinely running into a dead end and might go cold, Michigan State Trooper Barry Wolf took a phone call at his desk. Wolf, like other members of the investigative team, had been worried about the lack of progress they were making. But as he listened to this caller on the other line, he wasn't sure if he was getting the tip police had been hoping for, or if he was about to be sent on an insane wild goose chase. The caller was a woman who was named Fran Ballen. She was the wife of one of Marty's cousins, and she was a self-proclaimed psychic. On the phone, Fran told Officer Wolf that she had received important information about Marty's murder during a psychic reading, and she'd like to share this information with the police. And so Wolf told Fran he'd be right over to see her. Then, Officer Wolf told Sergeant Wilson about this call, and neither of the men really believed in psychic phenomena. But a person saying they had potentially important information about this case, especially someone who had a family connection to the victim, couldn't be ignored. So after speaking to Wilson, Wolf left the building, got into his cruiser, and went to meet Fran at her house to see what her supposed visions had shown her. When Wolf arrived, he found Fran sitting on her back porch, and she motioned for him to join her. Wolf introduced himself, thanked Fran for contacting him, and then took a seat next to her. Fran spoke in a low but very confident voice. She knew some people thought she was crazy or just making things up, but she trusted her psychic gifts, and she felt like the police should trust them too. Fran reached down beside her and took a small notebook out of a folder. She told Wolf that she had written down information she'd received during a recent psychic vision. Then she flipped open the notebook and began reading. Fran told Wolf that it was important for police to look under the couch or the love seat in Marty and Glenna's living room. Then Fran looked up and stared directly into Wolf's eyes and told him that Marty's right hand was also going to be very important to the investigation. When she said this, Wolf sat back in his chair and just stared at Fran in disbelief. Investigators had found that Ruger underneath the chair in the living room. Sure, that wasn't the same as a couch or a love seat, but that was pretty close. Also, Wolf was shocked to hear Fran mention Marty's right hand because Marty had been found clutching that patch of hair in his right hand. But Wolf's first thought was not that this woman was actually psychic. It was instead that she clearly had information about a crime scene that only somebody who had been there would know about. And so Wolf did not want to alarm Fran in any way that he could be onto her, and so instead he just smiled and told her that this was very interesting, and then he asked her where she had been at the time Marty was murdered. And Fran would tell him that she had been with her daughter. After that, Wolf thanked Fran again for getting in touch with him, and then he walked off her porch and went back to his car. Once he was inside and turned it back on, he gunned the engine and sped back to the station to tell the rest of the investigative team about this weird meeting. And once he did tell them about this weird meeting, the Michigan State Police had to either accept that Fran really got this information from a psychic reading she'd done, or they would have to add a local psychic to their list of suspects. Sergeant Wilson told investigators to follow up on Fran's alibi, and he could barely believe the turn this investigation was taking. But it wouldn't be long before Wilson realized having a psychic involved was not remotely the weirdest thing about this case. In October of 2015, so almost 5 months after the attack that left Marty dead, Sergeant Wilson finally got the call he'd been waiting for. Glenna had been released from the hospital, and she was now able to speak with police. Investigators had spent the last few months searching for that lost money and looking into the psychic's background, and they had come up empty. They had potential suspects, but none of them seemed all that viable. But now, Wilson would be able to talk to someone who was literally there when the attack happened, Glenna, and he hoped she'd be able to clear up a lot of the questions that he and his team still had. Glenna met with Wilson at the police station, and after they made it into the interview room, Wilson asked her, what do you remember about the day that you and your husband were attacked? And immediately, when Glenna began to talk, Wilson knew he was not going to get the clear-cut evidence he had been hoping for. Glenna told him she'd been struggling with her memory ever since she arrived at the hospital. She said she could barely remember anything about the day of the shooting, or even the days leading up to it. Wilson knew Glenna was dealing with a serious head injury, so her memory loss did not come as much of a surprise. But he still believed Glenna was going to be the key to figuring out who killed Marty. So Wilson began talking to Glenna about pieces of evidence that had been found at the scene, hoping maybe something would spark her memory. But by the end of the interview, Glenna had not remembered anything that could point the investigation in any one direction, and so Wilson began to feel lost again. So, as the weeks and months passed, investigators continued to pursue all of their potential leads, but they still had no clear killer, and Marty's family was now also starting to become very frustrated. They wanted answers, and they wanted some kind of closure. But even as the 1-year anniversary of Marty's murder approached, the case was still open, and people close to Marty had no idea if it would ever be closed. In May of 2016, so a year after Marty was killed, a news reporter for a Grand Rapids, Michigan TV station stared at a video playing on his computer screen. His eyes were wide and his mouth was hanging open. This guy couldn't believe what he was watching. On the video, Marty's pet parrot, Bud, was clinging to the side of his cage, and he was shouting in Marty's voice. Then the parrot's voice would completely change, and he would speak in somebody else's voice who was not shouting, and then the parrot would shift back into Marty's voice, and he would keep on shouting. The reporter was watching Bud mimic an argument the bird clearly had heard between Marty and somebody else, and the reporter was almost certain the other voice that Bud was mimicking belonged to Marty's killer, and that this argument must have taken place right before the murder. Because at one point in the video, Bud mimicked Marty's voice by yelling, "Don't fucking shoot!" The reporter watched the entire video, and then when it was done, he watched it again. And afterwards, he knew it had to be aired. The news station contacted Marty's first wife, Christina, who had gotten Bud back after Marty was killed. Christina told producers at the station that she was the one who had shot that video about a month after Marty's murder, but she had only told people who were close to her about it. She had never intended for it to make the news. But around the year anniversary of Marty's death, Marty's parents had done a follow-up interview with a local TV station, and during that interview, the video of Bud the parrot screaming "Don't fucking shoot" had come up, and eventually that video of Bud was shown to the local news crew. And then somehow, the video made its way to the much larger TV station in Grand Rapids. And not long after that, the Grand Rapids TV station played Bud's video on the news, and soon the story got picked up all over the world. Suddenly, Bud the parrot seemed like a hero. He was like a key witness to an unsolved murder, and everyone believed he was going to be the key to solving the case. The worldwide attention Bud's video brought to Marty's murder might have put added pressure on the investigative team. But police insisted that the parrot video did not change the way they were pursuing the case. Then, in June, a month after Bud's video appeared on TV, investigators announced they had actually made an arrest in Marty's murder case. Police maintained that Bud the parrot's supposed eyewitness account of the murder had nothing to do with the arrest. It just so happened that at this time, they had finally figured out who took the money from Marty's safe, and soon after that, they had discovered a piece of evidence that broke the case wide open and led them to Marty's killer. Based on evidence found at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened in the early morning hours of May 12, 2015, when someone killed Marty Durham in his bedroom. At 5 a.m. on May 12, 2015, the glow from the killer's phone lit their face as they walked down the hallway inside of Marty and Glenna's house. The killer was breathing heavily, and they were scared and nervous, but they managed to walk quietly towards the bedroom. Once they got there, the killer opened the bedroom door and stepped inside. The low light from the killer's phone provided enough illumination that the killer could see the African gray parrot in its cage. The killer quickly walked across the room to the closet, then they opened it up and used their phone light to locate the key to the large gun safe that was inside. Once they had the key, the killer held their breath and unlocked the safe. Tucked away amongst several hunting rifles, they found a loaded .22 caliber Ruger revolver. The killer grabbed the gun and stared at it in their hand for a second. Then they turned, stepped out of the closet, approached the bed, and just started yelling. And immediately, Marty, who was in bed, he sat up, totally startled, and the noise caused Bud the parrot to start squawking, which only added to the confusion. Marty kind of shook himself awake, and he saw the killer just standing there, and still not sure what was happening, Marty just began screaming too, so Marty, the parrot, and the killer are all yelling. But then, in the light from the killer's phone, and the glow from the moon that was coming in through the window, Marty noticed the killer had a gun by their side. And so Marty pulled himself up and out of bed, and right away he very likely felt that pain shooting through his legs and back, and at the same time Bud keeps squawking from his cage, and the killer kept shouting at Marty. I mean, it was absolutely chaos, but Marty was still hopeful he could maybe get out of there. And so Marty raised up his hands in a defensive position and tried to walk past the killer. The killer raised the gun and aimed it right at Marty's chest, and Marty screamed, "Don't fucking shoot!" But the killer fired. They fired 3 shots in rapid succession, hitting Marty in the chest again and again and again. Then the killer fired 2 more times, and those bullets struck Marty's forearm and his back as he fell. Marty collapsed on the floor, dead. And the killer just stood there, staring down at Marty's body. Then the killer took a deep breath, calmly walked out of the bedroom, and made their way towards the front door, and they unlocked it. Then the killer made their way to the living room, and they tipped a lamp off an end table onto the floor. Then they emptied a desk drawer and some shelves and made a total mess of the place. Then the killer just kind of stood there, scanning around their house, looking at what they had just done. So far, their plan had gone exactly the way they hoped, but the hardest part was yet to come. Finally, the killer took several deep breaths, doing their best to stay calm and steady. Then they raised their gun and placed the barrel behind their right ear, and they pulled the trigger. Immediately, blood began pouring out of the wound, and the room began to spin, but the killer kept their balance long enough to toss the gun under a nearby living room chair. Then the killer stumbled back into the bedroom and fell down onto the ground, and before they passed out, they grabbed a huge pile of blankets nearby and pulled them up and over their head. It would turn out Glenna had murdered Marty, and then obviously shot herself in the head. It turned out that Marty and Glenna's marriage had not been as perfect as some of their friends believed. Over the years, Glenna had racked up a huge amount of debt. She had lost about $75,000 gambling at nearby casinos, and as a result, she had stopped making mortgage payments on their house. But Marty never knew any of that. Not long before the murder, Glenna had learned that the house that Marty loved so much was now going into foreclosure. And so soon, he would learn the truth and they would both be forced out. Early on in the investigation, police had actually learned about the pending foreclosure, and they discovered Glenna's gambling habit. So they started to think that Glenna had killed Marty and then tried to kill herself, seeing a murder-suicide as her only way out. And this murder-suicide theory was only bolstered when police looked inside of that manila envelope that Marty's kids had found when they went to Marty's house to get Bud. The manila envelope contained several letters that Glenna had written to her kids and to her ex-husband. In the letters, Glenna expressed how sorry she was and asked them to please take care of each other. Police believed those letters sounded like suicide notes. But in a case involving a psychic and a talking bird, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Because if it was a murder-suicide, why had thousands of dollars been taken from the safe? Why was the house completely wrecked? And why had the gun been hidden in the living room when Marty and Glenna were found in their bedroom? Those were questions investigators had to answer if they were ever going to determine what had really happened. Finally, investigators discovered who had taken the money from the safe because Marty's kids had come forward and admitted they took the cash when they went to collect Bud the parrot. Even though Marty's kids had taken the money, police still didn't consider them primary suspects. Instead, they thought Marty's kids were just young and foolish and had made a very bad decision. So, with the money from the safe now accounted for, investigators were able to rule it out as a motive for the murder. And the psychic's alibi eventually checked out, so the investigators crossed her off of their suspect list, but they would be left wondering how she seemed to know undisclosed details about the crime scene. DNA tests conducted on the hair found inside of Marty's hand also did not end up helping investigators. So all of this brought Sergeant Wilson and his team back to the possibility of a murder and failed suicide attempt committed by Glenna. But of course, there were still unanswered questions. It wasn't like they had found the gun in Glenna's hand. Then, in early summer of 2016, the media and the public latched onto that viral video of Bud the parrot saying, "Don't fucking shoot," and many claimed the other voice that Bud was speaking in sounded an awful lot like Glenna. But police continued to rely on more common investigative techniques to determine if Glenna was, in fact, the killer. They dug deep into Glenna's phone records and internet history, and when they had a clear picture of Glenna's online activity, they got the break in the case they had been looking for. It turned out that hours before Marty's murder, Glenna had been online researching various aspects of the .22 caliber Ruger revolver, the type of gun used to kill Marty. And some investigators believed Glenna had learned a lot more than just how to fire or reload the weapon. They thought she had found a way to shoot herself that would allow her to live and enable her to keep functioning even after she had pulled the trigger. In fact, a neurosurgeon would testify in court that the wounds found behind Glenna's ear were non-lethal, and that those wounds would not necessarily result in a loss of consciousness. This meant that Glenna could have shot herself in the head in the living room and then still managed to hide the gun, get back to the bedroom, and get into position under the blankets, all before she was found. So, as bizarre as this case had seemed at times, investigators believed they had solved the most important part of the puzzle, that Glenna had murdered Marty. Some people close to the case would continue to believe that the crime was still the result of Glenna's failed murder-suicide plan, meaning Glenna really did intend to end her life, but just didn't, because where she shot herself was non-lethal, even though Glenna denied the letters she had written to her family were suicide notes. Others believed there were even darker motives at play, and that Glenna murdered Marty, then tried to make it look like a robbery, and then also tried to make herself look like a victim too, so they didn't believe suicide was ever part of Glenna's plan, that she definitely did try to intentionally shoot the part of her head that wouldn't kill her. This was all a big con. But it's not clear what Glenna's motives were for doing this. Like, what did she stand to gain by killing her husband and framing this whole thing? It just didn't make any sense. But regardless of what the actual reason was for why Glenna did what she did, by the summer of 2016, police had enough evidence to arrest her. Glenna was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of 2019, Bud the parrot was living with Marty's first wife, Christina, and a fellow African gray parrot named Ozzy. Christina said the two birds have become best friends. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Those are Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts, and you will find all of them. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the one you listened to today, but in video format on our YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. Go check it out. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Hello fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. I'm here today to tell you all about what it actually means now that we've moved over to the SiriusXM family. Big picture, it means we are going to make more content for you. Right now, you get one YouTube video a week on Saturday. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to have the Saturday upload be the same, but then also the Mr. Ballen podcast. Well, we've begun already filming those episodes like a YouTube video. So that's a second piece of content every week. Then there's 2 other shows that you guys don't even know about yet, which means on any given week, you could have up to 4 new video pieces of content on the Mr. Ballen channel. And also, all these pieces of content will double as podcasts as well. This new content schedule is going to start early next year. Also, there's one other thing I want to clarify, which is the state of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries and Redacted. Those shows were created in collaboration with Wondery, but now we're partnered with Sirius, and so we're not going to be making any new episodes of either of those shows. For now, if you want to hear my podcast episodes 1 week early and ad-free, make sure to subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. Keep on the lookout for more announcements in the coming weeks. Thank you. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today's podcast will feature 3 stories that demonstrate that. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Don't Mess with Doug, and it's about a criminal who picks the wrong house. The second story you'll hear is called The Ring, and it's truly so horrifying, it sounds like something out of a horror movie. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Strange Calls, and it's about a fishing trip that turns into a complete nightmare for 4 men. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right show, because that's all we do. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to mow the follow button's grass. But do it in a totally disorganized fashion, leaving huge chunks of uncut grass. Okay, let's get into our first story called Don't Mess with Doug. Around midnight on September 3rd, 1986, Doug Wells and his wife Kristen were pulling onto their street in western Montana when they noticed a camper parked in front of their house. Neither of them recognized the camper, and so when they pulled into their driveway, Doug got out and walked over and looked inside to see if anyone was in there. And there was a man sleeping in the front seat. Doug didn't wake him up. Instead, he went back to his wife, they talked about it, and they decided that this man must have just randomly parked in front of their house, and that most likely the next day he would leave. And so the couple went inside their house and they began getting ready for bed. At some point, Doug rounded up all the trash inside of the house and was going to bring it outside to put into the trash bin. And when he went outside, standing in his front lawn is the same guy who was just sleeping inside of the camper. And so Doug very cautiously goes down the front steps and he yells out to this guy and says, what are you doing here? And immediately the man put his hands up and said he meant no harm. He said his name was Wayne Nance, and he actually worked with Doug's wife, Kristen, at the furniture store in town. Wayne went on to say that he happened to be driving down their street earlier that day, and he spotted someone standing outside one of their windows looking in their house, and he knew it was Kristen's house, and he looked in their driveway, and he saw that Kristen wasn't home, and it looked like nobody was home. And so he decided he would just park out front and try to scare off this person and wait for Kristen to get back. But by the time Kristen got back, he had fallen asleep. Doug was totally caught off guard by this whole situation. The idea that there's this guy on his property talking about another guy that was lurking around his property. And so he asked Wayne, did you see this guy again after that first time you saw him? And Wayne said no, he hadn't, but he didn't have a flashlight. And so maybe if Doug went in the house and got some flashlights, the 2 of them could walk the property and make sure nobody was there. Doug thanked him for the offer and said, okay, well, why don't you come in the house and I'll go look for those flashlights. And so Doug led the way inside of his house. And as soon as Wayne got in the house and shut the front door behind him, he pulled out a metal pipe he was hiding and smashed Doug over the back of the head. Doug turned around and Wayne hit him again over the face. And before long, the 2 of them were struggling on the ground. Kristen, who was upstairs, heard the commotion, and she came running down the stairs, and she sees at the bottom her husband, who's bleeding profusely from his head. He's covering himself up on the ground, while Wayne, her co-worker, is standing over him, punching and kicking him. Before Kristen could do anything, Wayne noticed her up on the stairs, and he drew a pistol and aimed it at her and told her to come down here and tie up your husband's arms and legs. Kristen, who's in shock, is just hoping this was just a robbery and that they would have their lives spared. And so she does as she's told. She walks down, Wayne throws her some cord, she ties up her husband's arms and legs, and then afterwards, Wayne leads Kristen back upstairs to the bedroom where he ties her up as well. After that, Wayne went back down to the main floor where Doug was still laying on the ground, and he grabbed Doug by the legs and he pulled him down the flight of stairs to the basement where he tied him up to a pole, and then he savagely beat him with the pipe before Wayne pulled out an 8-inch blade and plunged it directly into Doug's chest all the way in. And then when he pulled it out again, Doug slumped over. Wayne went back upstairs all the way to the second floor to check on Kristen, and he saw she had managed to get partially out of her restraints and she was reaching for the landline, and so he jumped on top of her and managed to restrain her all over again, and then after he was confident in her restraints, he went back downstairs to make sure Doug was dead. When he got down there, he saw Doug was still slouched over in the same position he had left him, and so Wayne assumed Doug must be dead. And Wayne went back upstairs to assault Kristen. But Wayne was wrong. Doug wasn't dead. And after Wayne went upstairs that second time, Doug, despite his horrific head and chest injuries, managed to wriggle out of his restraints and then hobbled over to a workbench where he had a rifle laying out because Doug was actually a gunsmith. And so he took the rifle and he loaded it with the one round he found on the table, and then he walked over to the base of the stairs, he raised his rifle, and he made his way up to the main floor. He didn't come in contact with Wayne, and he looked around the first floor, he didn't see him, and he heard his wife screaming upstairs. And so he made his way to the next set of stairs and began walking up with his rifle raised. At the top of the stairs to the second floor, there was a hallway that ran right and left out of sight. And so as Doug is making his way up, he can hear off to the left, out of view, his wife screaming in the bedroom, and he can hear the sound of very heavy footsteps running down the hall towards the landing where he is. And so Doug positioned himself in the stairwell, he took aim about chest height with his rifle, and he waited for their attacker to show himself. And so as soon as Wayne came flying around the corner with his knife in his hand, Doug just fired one shot that struck him right in the stomach. Wayne fell backwards, totally shocked at what had just happened. He began to stagger, and Doug, meanwhile, turned his rifle around like a baseball bat because he didn't have any more rounds, and he just starts walking down the hall, smashing Wayne, as Wayne continues to stumble and fall and try to run away from Doug, and finally, he gets away from Doug, charges into the bedroom where Kristen is, and he grabs his pistol, and he turns around and he fires 3 shots towards the door where Doug is now standing. And Doug, he's unfazed. One round hits him in the leg, the other 2 miss, he doesn't care. He just walks up to Wayne and begins bashing his head in with the back of this rifle. He hits him so many times that the buttstock of the rifle explodes and the metal of the rifle bends like an L. And at some point, Wayne drops the gun because he's getting viciously beaten on by Doug and his rifle. And Doug sees that, he grabs the pistol and he fires the remaining rounds into Wayne's head. Police and paramedics would show up shortly thereafter, and Doug, Kristen, and their attacker Wayne were all rushed to the hospital. Doug and Kristen would make full recoveries. As for Wayne, he would die the following day from his injuries. After the incident, the police investigated Wayne Nance to see who this guy was, and they discovered that almost certainly he had been a serial killer that was connected to at least 6 cold case murders from 1974 to 1986. But because Wayne never confessed to any of these murders before he died, the true number of people he killed is still unknown. Our next story is called The Ring. In May of 2011, 27-year-old Michalina Lewandowska was surprised when she got a text message from her on-again, off-again boyfriend, 27-year-old Marcin Kaspersak. The pair had actually previously been engaged and had a 3-year-old son together, but they just could never seem to make it work for longer than a couple of months at a time. In the text message, Marcin was asking Michalina if he could take her shopping, something he knew she liked to do. As for Michalina, lately she had been turning down requests like this one from Marcin, and she was inclined to at first, but their son was already being looked after by her mother, and Michalina didn't have plans that day, and so she thought, you know what the heck? And so she said yes. So Michalina took a shower and got ready and even put on her engagement ring that Marcin had given her, and then she waited by the door. A little while later, Marcin, who was an aspiring bodybuilder who had become addicted to taking steroids, showed up at her Huddersfield, England home. Michalina opened the door, Marcin came inside, and then as soon as the door shut behind him, he tased Michalina, he jumped on top of her, and then he bound and gagged her. And then once she was restrained on the ground with no idea what was going on, Marcin opened the front door and waved down to his car that was parked on the curb, and one of his friends, this 18-year-old named Patrick, came out and walked up to the house and came inside. And then Patrick and Marcin worked together to cram Michalina into this small, rugged cardboard box. And then once she was forced inside of there, they closed it up, taped it shut, and then brought the box down to the front of the house and put it into Marcin's trunk. And then Marcin and Patrick hopped in the front two seats of the car and drove off. Once they reached the outskirts of town, they parked in a parking lot right next to this huge forest. And from there, they took the box with Michalina inside of it and 2 shovels and walked into the woods, and at some point they left the path and walked way away from where anybody would normally be until they felt like they were far enough away that no one would see them. And at that point, they put Michalina down, and then using their shovels, they dug a grave. Once it was deep enough, they put Michalina in her box inside of the grave, and then they covered her back up with dirt and then put a 90-pound log on top of her. And then the 2 of them just walked away, leaving Michalina to die. In the box, Michalina was not dead yet, but she knew if she attempted to escape with Marcin and Patrick right above her, they would just kill her on the spot, or they would dig an even deeper hole, and then it would be impossible to get out again. And so after waiting an agonizingly long amount of time to ensure Marcin and Patrick had gone, Michalina jumped into action. She immediately tried to wriggle her way out of her restraints, but the position they had forced her into, which was basically the fetal position with her hands tied behind her back, it didn't allow her to move very much in any one direction, and so without any movement, she could not get herself to come free of these restraints. And so as she's struggling, trying to figure out what she's going to do, she realizes she had chosen to wear her engagement ring that Marcin had given her, something she never wore anymore, and she could potentially use the diamonds in the ring to cut through the tape that was keeping her wrists tied together. And so she began working that ring until finally she did cut through her restraints and her hands were free. And so she managed to force both of her arms right in front of her body. And then once they were in front of her, she immediately began scratching and clawing at the cardboard right above her. And eventually she scratched a hole in the box itself and dirt began pouring in on her. And she was already very low on oxygen. She was fighting off unconsciousness by remembering that her 3-year-old son needed her, and she had no idea what Marcin was going to do to him. And so she just kept on digging and fighting as the dirt's coming in on her and she's struggling to breathe. And then finally she pokes all the way through and she can see sunlight and fresh air comes into the hole. She can breathe again. And then with this huge surge of adrenaline, she forces herself and manages to push all the way up through this hole until she's standing in her grave. And from there, she pulls herself up and out of the dirt, and she runs towards the road where she flags down a motorist, and the motorist would call police and then wait with her until they arrived. After Marcin was arrested, the story came out that he had heard a rumor that Michalina was going to be leaving him and going back to Poland with their son, and he didn't want that, so he had decided he was going to kill her. Marcin was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison, and Patrick was found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called Strange Calls. In the early morning hours before sunrise on April 12, 1990, a 31-year-old man named Nathan Neesmith pushed down on the gas throttle of the fishing boat that he was steering just off the coast of Georgia. And as he did this, he expected the boat to naturally kind of kick into a higher gear and go faster. But as he pushed that throttle down, nothing really happened, and the boat just kind of sputtered along, going about half the speed that he expected it to go. Confused, Nathan stepped away and began making his way out towards the deck, where his younger brother, Billy Joe, who was actually the captain of this fishing boat, was out there taking a nap, and Nathan figured, if there was any issue with the boat, Billy Joe was the guy to talk to. He would know how to fix it. Now, for context, the two brothers were on the first day of a 7-day fishing trip that actually Nathan was not supposed to be a part of. The crew was originally going to be Billy Joe, the captain, and the one who actually rented the boat, along with Billy Joe's nephew and also 2 other commercial fishermen. But at the last second, those 2 other commercial fishermen had bowed out, and Nathan and a friend had volunteered to go to round out the crew. Now, Nathan and Billy Joe, they came from a fishing family, but it was really only Billy Joe who had pursued the family business. Now, Nathan was perfectly handy out on the water and did know how to fish and knew his way around a fishing boat, but compared to Billy Joe, there was a massive gap in experience. Billy Joe was the fisherman, and Nathan really was not. But Nathan and Billy Joe were very close, and so as soon as Nathan heard Billy Joe was in trouble and needed some more fishermen, Nathan didn't hesitate to say he would do it. Because really, for their entire lives, that was sort of their dynamic. Even though Nathan was the older brother, it was Nathan who looked up to Billy Joe, and any chance he got, he would do anything to help Billy Joe. And Billy Joe really respected that and loved that about Nathan. But now, as Nathan made his way out to the deck to wake his brother up to tell him on the first day of the trip, right as Nathan's taking the wheel, that something's wrong with the boat and I can't fix it. And also, Nathan was enormous, like 250 pounds, well over 6 feet tall. He was huge, this big physical presence, but he really was not mechanically savvy at all. And so again, Nathan is sort of feeling like, sorry, and also maybe even second guessing whether or not it was even a good idea for him to have come along. If he can't even fix a minor issue with the throttle or the engine, what's he doing here? But when Nathan woke up his younger brother and explained the issue, Billy Joe was not upset. He was like, okay, we'll go down below and we'll take a look at the engine and make sure everything is okay. However, when they went down and Billy Joe opened up this hatch to look at the engine, smoke immediately came out, and it was very clear to Billy Joe anyways, that this was not like a minor issue. Something seriously was wrong with the engine. This was a big problem. And so Billy Joe began cussing, he's totally frustrated, and he just told Nathan to, go down below and tell the other 2 to wake up and come help. And so huge Nathan turned around and went down into the bunk room down below, and the second he got down to that level of the fishing boat, he just stopped. Because there was at least a foot of water in the hallway and in the bunk room when he went inside. And so Nathan screamed at the other 2 fishermen to get up. And so they got up and they're looking down, they're seeing all this water. And so they're starting to panic. And Nathan, he goes back upstairs and he yells to Billy Joe, who's dealing with this engine issue, that in addition to that, it appears the boat is also sinking. And so Billy Joe is like, get buckets, go down there and start bailing out the water. I'm going to call Mayday. And so Billy Joe runs back up to the steering wheel. He grabs the radio. And Nathan and the others can hear him yelling over and over again, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday! And as that was happening, Nathan and the other 2 fishermen put on their life vests, grabbed buckets, and went down below to begin manually bailing out the water. But the second they got down there, it was very obvious the water, wherever it was leaking into this ship, was coming in way faster than they could potentially bail out. But they kept doing it, getting the water out as fast as they could, trying to stay calm. They can hear Billy getting more and more frantic, yelling Mayday over and over again. And then all the lights inside of the ship began to flicker, and then they went out, and they were cast into total darkness. The engine basically had stopped, and it was just silence, just the sound of water rushing into this boat. Also, Billy Joe had stopped yelling Mayday because clearly the boat had lost power and the radio didn't work. And unfortunately, before the power cut out, nobody had heard any of Billy Joe's Mayday calls. So nobody knew where they were, nobody knew they were sinking, and without power, they had no way to communicate to anybody. They were totally alone. So Nathan, Billy Joe, and the others did the only thing they could do. They went up to the main deck, they grabbed their inflatable life raft, they blew it up, chucked it over the side, they grabbed as many supplies as they could, put it in the raft, they all made sure they had all their flotation on, and then they jumped into the life raft, abandoning the sinking fishing boat. Now, once all 4 men were safely inside of this life raft, they were not as panicked as you might think they would be, because they had put enough food and water in this raft to last them at least several days. They all again had their life vests on, so proper flotation, and even though nobody responded to those Mayday calls, it wasn't impossible to think that maybe somebody had heard the Mayday calls and they just had not called back. Maybe there was a rescue operation coming to their location right now. They didn't know. But it felt plausible that they could be rescued. They would just need to kind of ration out their supplies and stay optimistic. However, their optimism quickly faded when after only being in this life raft for 30 minutes, right as the sun was starting to come up, Nathan began to hear a strange sound. It was coming from somewhere in the life raft. He couldn't quite place the sound, and so at first he kind of tried to ignore it, but then he noticed the life raft was becoming softer, and then he realized the sound he heard was a small hiss. The raft had a leak. And even though the four men were able to trace the sound of this leak to the actual puncture, they didn't have a patch kit or any meaningful way to patch up this hole. And so all they could do was just put their hands over this leak and do their best to seal it. But it didn't stop the air from coming out. It just delayed it. And so over the next hour, again, as the sun is just coming up on the second day of their big fishing trip, the raft finally completely deflated, and all four men were suddenly bobbing in the freezing cold ocean, surrounded by the wreckage of their sinking fishing boat. And so eventually, the men grabbed the biggest piece of wood from the wreckage that came floating by, and it was buoyant enough that it kind of served as like a makeshift raft, but it wasn't buoyant enough to hold all four of them at once, which meant, they had to take turns resting on this raft, and then they'd have to get back in the ocean and kind of wait their turn again. I mean, totally miserable. And as this was happening, they just stared at the hull of their sinking fishing boat that was still poking up out of the ocean, just drift farther and farther away from them because the current was pretty strong. And as they watched their ship just kind of disappear into the distance, and they're just kind of drifting out into the middle of the ocean, they were all just stunned into silence. They could not believe how this had happened and so quickly. And also, what were they going to do? I mean, they're in the worst possible situation here. It just didn't seem possible that they could actually survive this. Now, for reference, even though the men had salvaged a lot of their food and water from the sinking life raft, and they had their flotation devices on, that didn't protect them from hypothermia. It wouldn't matter if it was super warm outside. What mattered is the ocean was really cold. And because they couldn't stay on that raft, they had to keep cycling through, going back in the ocean over and over again. It was just a matter of time before they would get hypothermia. And sometimes hypothermia can kick in just a couple of hours. I mean, we're not talking days here. This is going to be quick. And all these guys knew that. And so as these men were forced to have these really morbid discussions around who's going to stay in the water and who's going to stay on the raft, Nathan made a drastic decision. Nathan, being by far the biggest physically out of the four men, he knew that if he wasn't there right now, the other three could easily fit on their makeshift raft and stay out of the water, delaying hypothermia, thereby increasing the odds that they got rescued. And so Nathan did what he always did, and he turned to his younger brother, who he looked up to so much, who he just wanted to help all the time, and Nathan told him, I'm going to swim to the wreckage. I'm going to swim back to the hull of our sinking ship, and I'm going to fashion my own makeshift raft. That way you guys can have this one, and I'll have my own, and we can all get out of here in one piece. Now, keep in mind, it was fairly obvious that the hull of the sinking ship, which was barely visible near the horizon, was at least 3 miles away just from their own rough calculations. So this is a monster swim to get to that. And so immediately, Billy Joe and the other three were like, no, that is a suicide mission. You cannot do that. Do not swim to the hull. You're not going to make it. Now, just to give some additional context here, if you're not familiar with just how challenging swimming in the open ocean is, I'm going to give you my limited experience. So when I was in the military, we had to do one 5.5 mile open ocean swim. And then also we did a whole bunch of 2 mile ocean swims. And even though we were allowed to use amazing wetsuits and fins, we had a swim partner with us, we had the land nearby to use as a reference to make sure we're going the right direction, we had food, we had water, we were in great shape. Even with all of that, open ocean swims are miserable. You get all the salt in your mouth and your nose, you start cramping and chafing. I mean, it takes hours and hours and hours to swim some of these distances, and you're constantly fighting against the waves. I mean, it is an absolute chore swimming in the open ocean, again, even with all the right stuff in place. And you got to remember, Nathan is this big guy, he's got this big bulky life vest on that's going to make it hard to swim. He doesn't have fins, he doesn't have a wetsuit, and he's got no landmarks around him, to make sure he's going in a straight line. Typically, when you're swimming in the ocean, you're constantly looking at the land or some other landmark to make sure you're going in the right direction. He wouldn't have had that. And also, it's this unknown distance he's covering, and there could be predators in the water. I mean, there's so many barriers here that basically there was like a 0% chance this swim would be successful. But Nathan totally understood what he was really doing here. He didn't really know if he was actually going to make it to that boat. Frankly, that was not really the point. what he was really doing was choosing to sacrifice himself to potentially save his brother and the other two. And so even though they were telling him, do not go, do not swim in that direction, you're not going to make it, Nathan just turned to his brother Billy Joe and said, I love you. And then he turned and began swimming. And by some miracle, 11 hours later, right as the sun was setting, Nathan was still alive and still swimming, and he did reach the sinking boat that still had its hull poking out of the water. Now, when Nathan got to the sinking ship, he was almost dead from dehydration, from hypothermia. I mean, he's miserable, but he's made it to his destination completely against all odds. He climbed up onto this hull, and he found a spot on the hull of the ship that supported his weight, and he managed to tie himself using some rope or maybe his life vest to the hull, so he was anchored in place. And then he didn't get to sleep, because the whole time he's thinking, this thing could sink under the water at any point, and it will drag me with it because I'm tied to it, or he could just drift off of it if his rigging kind of came undone, if he was asleep. And so all night, beyond exhausted, he's just holding on to this hull, not really sure what's going to happen, but here he is, just waiting it out. And then finally, when the sun came up that next morning, as Nathan looked around him, he's in the middle of the ocean, he sees in the direction he had come from, this pillar of smoke coming up over the horizon. And so Nathan, he rubs his eyes, he can't believe it, he's thinking, there's no way, there's already a ship out here, we're in the middle of nowhere. But sure enough, slowly but surely, this massive freighter ship came into view that was very far away. It's not near Nathan, but he can see it clear as day. And where this ship was basically circling was roughly where he believed his brother and the other two fishermen were still floating. And so he's thinking, oh my goodness, the freighter is going to save them, and then it's going to come save me. And so Nathan just clung onto the hull and watched as this freighter made these big, slow loops right around that same area. And then the freighter came to a full stop, and it appeared to lower something down into the water. It seemed very much like a full-blown rescue operation. And then, about 3 hours after he first spotted this freighter, the freighter began to move again, and this time directly towards Nathan. Nathan was so relieved he could practically cry. But instead what he did is he thought, they're going to be here in a minute. I'm finally just going to close my eyes and go to sleep. And so he put his head down on the hull, looked one more time at the freighter, and then closed his eyes. Now, Nathan would be rescued, but it would not be by that huge freighter ship. Nathan eventually had opened his eyes after closing them for a second, and he saw this freighter that had been coming straight for him at some point had kind of deviated and gone in the wrong direction and then vanished over the horizon, never to be seen again. And it would take 3 more days before a separate ship happened to find Nathan, they scooped him up, and they rescued him. But even though Nathan had been really crushed when that freighter had gone the wrong way, he held on to this idea that, that freighter had clearly rescued his brother and the other two fishermen, and certainly, even if they couldn't find him, they would go back and they would tell the authorities that Nathan is out there, he swam back to the hull of the ship, we gotta go find him. And so certainly a rescue effort would be on the way, and it was true. A rescue boat had come out and found Nathan, so everything seemed to be tracking. And when Nathan woke up inside of his hospital room back on land, his friends and family were all by his bedside, and he's looking around. He can't believe he survived. And the first thing he asks is, how's my brother? How are the other two fishermen? And why didn't that freighter pick me up too? And at this, all the people in the room just kind of looked at Nathan with a very confused look on their face. And eventually they asked him a question that made Nathan burst out in tears. They said, what freighter? It would turn out Billy Joe and the other two fishermen were still missing at this point, and nobody had heard a thing about some big freighter in the area. As far as anybody knew, at least in Nathan's family, that freighter ship did not exist. The search for Billy Joe and the remaining 2 crew members went on for weeks and weeks, and while the active search out on the ocean was going on, the Coast Guard and police were searching through every record they could possibly find of basically any ship that was even roughly in the area where Nathan and the others had been. But despite looking everywhere, there was basically no sign that any ship of any kind had been there beyond the rescue operation that eventually scooped up Nathan. And so again, it seemed very likely that that freighter ship didn't exist, and, it was possible that Nathan, in his very deteriorated state, had maybe hallucinated it. Although Nathan was adamant, he definitely saw that ship. It did not feel like, a multi-hour-long hallucination. It felt like he was watching a ship. He was sure of it. But again, there was just no proof, and so nobody knew what to think of that. And then eventually, even though there was this huge search going on, there was just no sign of Billie Joe or the others. And so eventually the search was called off. And unfortunately, the presumption was Billie Joe and the other two were now dead. 5 months later, on the afternoon of October 5th, 1990, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home. Now, by this point, the victims' families had all tried to sort of restart their lives following this tragedy, but deep down, none of them could truly accept that Billie Joe and the other two fishermen were just gone. They just couldn't do it. It was too soon. It felt like, any moment they were going to get news that, they had been rescued by some freighter ship or something. And so anytime a phone rang in any of these families' homes, it's like they would rush to the phone with the sense of hope that this time it's going to be different, their loved ones are going to be okay, only to obviously be crushed when that was not the case. But on this day, on October 5th, that phone call that came through in Nathan's sister's home, that one was different. When Nathan's mother picked up this phone call in Nathan's sister's home, she answered it and said hello, and right away she thought, oh, this has to be a wrong number, because the person who was calling was speaking in rapid Spanish and she didn't understand what they were saying. But as she was about to hang up, the caller intermittently throughout their rapid Spanish began saying something in English that Nathan's mother could understand, and it totally shocked her. The caller kept saying Nathan's sister's name over and over again, followed by Nathan's sister's phone number, like on repeat, the name, the phone number in English over and over and over again. And Nathan's mom is so caught off guard by this that she just listened, not even sure what to do. And then before she could ask any follow-up questions, the caller cut the line and the phone call was over. And then a few minutes later, another phone rang in a home that was not far away from Nathan's sister's home. And this other home belonged to the boat owner who Billie Joe had rented the fishing boat from that unfortunately sank and caused this whole tragedy. And so this boat owner, he picks up the phone, he answers it, and just like the call that had come through in Nathan's sister's house, this call was the same. It was somebody calling, speaking rapid Spanish, and the boat owner was about to hang up when he heard something that he understood because it was in English, and what he heard was his own name followed by his phone number over and over and over again. Basically the same type of call that Nathan's mom had just heard. And then before the boat owner could ask any questions, the line went dead. Now, one phone call like this, you could chalk up to maybe a prank or a wrong number or just a really weird coincidence. But to have those two calls happen within minutes of each other and basically take on the exact same form, but different names and different phone numbers, it just seemed way too coincidental to not be somehow connected to the missing fishermen. Because the link between these two households where these calls came in was the doomed fishing trip. And these calls did not stop. Every few weeks after this first time these calls came through, the phone would ring in Nathan's sister's house or in the boat owner's house, and it would be the same thing all over again. Rapid Spanish followed by either Nathan's sister's name and then her phone number, or the boat owner's name and his phone number. Just like that for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so as soon as this started happening, Nathan's family and the boat owner, they figured out they were both getting these weird calls, and they contacted authorities, which kind of restarted the search for Billie Joe and the missing fishermen, because now it seemed very plausible that maybe Nathan really had seen a freighter, and that freighter really had picked up Billie Joe and the others. And, maybe they had been taken to another country, a Spanish-speaking country, and maybe people were trying to get in touch with the families now to get them back home. Or, of course, there could be a negative side to this, that maybe they were captured by some rogue vessel and were being held by these people who were calling. I mean, there's any number of theories, but it made authorities wonder, hey, what's going on here? And so authorities got in touch with Mexican authorities and other Spanish-speaking country authorities and tried to figure out if there was any chance that there was, a vessel out there around the time that Billie Joe and the others were missing that in theory could have maybe illegally been in that area or something. But despite this kind of exhaustive effort to kind of look again to see if maybe there was a freighter in that area, there was just no evidence that there was. It made no sense, but the authorities said, look, we have no idea what these calls are about. We still do not think that freighter or any ship that even resembled a freighter was out there. We still believe that Billie Joe and the others are dead. But as for the victims' families, they just didn't buy that. They really believed that these strange phone calls were somehow connected to Billie Joe and the missing fishermen. Specifically, these calls must signal that Billie Joe and the others were still alive. They just had no evidence to support that. That is, until March 6th, 1991, so almost a year after the doomed fishing vessel sank and Billie Joe and the others went missing, On that day, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home, and she answered it, and it was the voice who spoke in rapid Spanish, but this time they spoke in perfect English, and all they said was, "I'm bringing him home." And then the line went dead. And Nathan's sister screamed and she yelled for her husband to call police. They contacted the authorities, and again, it kind of brought back to life the search for Billy Joe and the missing fisherman. And then after this call, there was a near constant presence of authorities on the Georgia coastline, basically looking out to the water, waiting, hoping for Billy Joe and the others to return. But unfortunately, they never did. And following that last phone call where the caller spoke in perfect English and said, "I'm bringing him home," after that, the call stopped. And so to this day, no one has ever been able to actually figure out what happened to Billy Joe and the other two fishermen. They are presumed dead at this point, but there's this one nagging question that surrounds the whole story, and that is, what did Nathan see? Was that actually a freighter picking up Billy Joe and the others? And if so, what did they do with them? Or was Nathan just hallucinating? It's entirely possible, but Nathan has always said he knows what he saw, and that was not a hallucination. As for the families of the victims, they still firmly believe that their loved ones are still out there, and someday they will come back home, and the families just hope they're alive long enough to be there for the reunion. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the Mr. Ballen podcast, as well as Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a June night in 1997, Kathy Peters was asleep at her home in Mirror Lake, a quiet neighborhood of Sarasota, Florida. Around 3:45 a.m., she was startled awake by a strange noise. It was unlike anything Kathy had heard, a faint, eerie, rattling hiss. After a few seconds, the sound faded, and Kathy tried to go back to sleep. But now she was too anxious. So she got up and crossed to the window. She opened the blinds and looked across the lake's glassy surface. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then she nearly jumped out of her skin when a loud metallic banging noise sounded right below her window. Somebody was pounding on her screen door. Kathy ran downstairs, having no idea who could be bothering her at this time of the night. She considered not answering, but Mirror Lake was a very safe community, so there had to be a reasonable explanation here. So she opened the door. Through the screen, she could see someone standing in the darkness. Kathy asked who it was and what they wanted, but the figure didn't say anything. Now, Kathy was terrified, so she switched on the porch light, and when she saw what was in front of her, she reeled back in horror. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please remember, before you do anything mean to the follow button, walk a mile in their shoes. That way, when you bully them, you're a mile away and you have their shoes. Okay, let's get into today's story. June 20th, 1997 started out as a perfect day for Henry Kaniva. The wiry, silver-mustached 76-year-old arrived at the Toyota dealership in Sarasota shortly after dawn. Getting to work early meant that he got first pick of the morning customers, which was how he liked it. By lunch, he'd already made 2 sales, and he was working on his third. And when that third customer signed for her car, Henry handed her the keys and felt that familiar rush of victory. He'd worked plenty of jobs throughout his life, but selling cars was the first thing that he truly loved, and he was really good at it. Henry had an effortless charm and a sort of unthreatening quality that made people trust him. He enjoyed talking to strangers, and he had no plans of slowing down or retiring. Growing up in the Great Depression had imprinted on him a set of unshakable values. He believed that you should work hard, save every dime you can, and treat every day like it's your last. And that mindset had served him well over the years. But life still had come with plenty of setbacks. 2 decades ago, his marriage had fallen apart, and so he'd upended his life and moved from California to Florida. Finding a new job there had been easy with Henry's sales experience, but he had not expected to find love again, too. He'd met his current girlfriend, Janet Scott, a little over 6 years earlier, when Janet had come into Henry's dealership looking to buy a car. She'd left with a car, and also with Henry's phone number. Their relationship quickly progressed from friendly dinners to romance. And Janet never seemed to mind that she was 26 years younger than Henry. She laughed at his jokes, loved his cooking, and put up with his constant car talk. Janet was also a salesperson in her own way. She worked at the Hallmark store at the Sarasota Square Mall, selling cards, chocolates, and stuffed animals. And that day, while Henry was getting ready to sell his third car, Janet was helping a shopper pick out a condolences card for a funeral. As she pulled different options from the rack, Janet couldn't help but feel a twinge of heartache. It was not that long ago that her own mailbox had been flooded with cards like these. Just before she met Henry, her husband, Roe, had died from a heart attack. Janet still wore the diamond engagement ring that Roe had given her, right next to the inexpensive topaz one that Henry had gotten her a few years earlier. She was comfortable in her relationship with Henry, but she knew not to expect a wedding ring from him. Henry had never actually gotten around to filing divorce paperwork for his first marriage, so he was still legally married to his ex in California, and they had 2 adult kids together, a son and a daughter. But Henry hardly ever spoke to his kids these days, which made Janet sad. She'd seen the same thing happen to her late husband. Roe had had an adult daughter from a former marriage, and they'd grown distant after Roe married Janet. Janet thought that Roe had regretted not repairing that relationship before he died, and so she didn't want Henry to die without getting a chance to patch things up with his kids. But she wasn't sure how to help him do that. As upbeat and charming as Henry was, he could also be very private and stuck in his ways. But Janet took a last look at the condolence card her customer chose and resolved to talk to Henry about his kids that night. After purchasing their card, the customer left, and Janet began closing up the store. 20 minutes later, she was driving past sandy white beaches teeming with senior citizens. Sarasota was a magnet for people like Henry, looking to spend their twilight years in the Florida sun. Pretty soon, Janet reached the peaceful neighborhood of Mirror Lake. Janet's spacious one-story house was at the very end of the road, with a red back door looking out to the water. Her late husband, Roe, had lived there with his first family before he met Janet, and then Janet lived there throughout their marriage, and she inherited the place when Roe died. Now, because Roe literally had died in this house, initially, Janet felt hesitant about the idea of letting Henry move in. But Henry had eventually sold her on the idea of him moving in by pointing out how much money they would save if he gave up his apartment. And so he moved in. When Janet walked in the door, she was immediately hit with a delicious smell wafting in from the kitchen. She smiled as she watched Henry move about the kitchen, dashing over for a kiss before hurrying back to the oven. Any discomfort that she might have felt about Henry living here in Rose's old house clearly was not shared. Henry had made himself right at home. After dinner, Janet cuddled on the couch with Henry and her dog Kissy while they watched some local news. And then, around 11 p.m., she remembered her plan to talk to Henry about his kids. But when she looked over at Henry, she could see he was already drifting off to sleep. So Janet switched off the TV and sent her fiancé to bed. The conversation could wait. Janet took Kissy out to the backyard for a quick walk, and then, after coming back inside, she headed to their bedroom, where she removed her rings and set them on the nightstand before climbing into bed beside Henry. The next thing Janet knew, she was dragged from sleep by this blinding pain. And then her surprise gave way to terror when she realized someone was sitting on top of her, pinning her to the bed with their knees while twisting at her neck. Janet started to scream and thrash, but her attacker just punched her repeatedly in the head and chest. Janet tasted blood and started to black out, but she kept struggling, trying to get free. And suddenly, she and her attacker fell off the bed and hit the floor. But before she could get back to her feet, she felt a pull on her legs, and her attacker was right back on top of her, squeezing at her throat. Janet made a final attempt to push her attacker off, but by this point, she was exhausted and disoriented, and slowly, everything went black. Sometime later, Janet woke up on her bedroom floor. Her temple and her throat throbbed with pain, but her attacker was gone. At least they weren't on top of her anymore, and she couldn't see anybody else in the room. Janet lifted her head, trying her best to ignore the pain. She couldn't see much, since it was pitch black in the room and one of her eyes was swollen shut. But as she sat up, Janet heard something, a hoarse, raspy wheezing sound. She didn't know where the sound was coming from or what it could be. All she knew was she needed to get away right now. Painfully, she got up and fumbled through the dark until she found the landline phone on the small vanity table. She picked it up to call the police, but the line was dead. And so Janet left the phone and staggered down the hall and went out the back door. And from there, she headed over to her neighbor's home. When she got there, she desperately banged on the door until her neighbor, a woman named Kathy Peters, answered. And when the neighbor, Kathy, looked out and saw Janet standing there with her shattered face, she was so surprised that she immediately jumped backwards in fright. Janet was actually so bruised and bloodied that Kathy did not recognize her at first. But when she realized who was standing there, she pulled Janet inside, locked the door, and ran to call 911. An ambulance arrived within minutes to take Janet to the hospital, and not a moment too soon. Even as the EMTs loaded her onto the stretcher, she was already losing consciousness again. At almost the same time, several sheriff's deputies arrived at Janet's house. They found the back door unlocked, and so they headed inside. The moment they entered the master bedroom, the deputies knew there had been an extremely violent attack here. Drawers had been pulled from the dresser and dumped all over the floor. There was blood spatter on the blinds and all over the sheets, and a thick puddle of blood was on the floor right where Janet fell. And there, lying on the bed, was Henry. His face was covered in blood, and he had a belt cinched tightly around his neck. The deputies checked him for a pulse, but the man was obviously dead from strangulation. After discovering Henry's body, the deputies began searching the room. One of the deputies was down on his hands and knees, peering under the bed, when he got startled by a pair of eyes staring back at him. It was Janet's dog, Kissy, cowering under the bed, shaking in terror. She refused to come out when the deputy called to her, so he crawled under and pulled her out. Once the deputy had the dog in his arms, it became clear that Kissy was not just terrified. Her eyes were dilated like she had a concussion, and there was some blood around her head, suggesting she had been beaten too. One of the deputies volunteered to take Kissy to a local pet hospital, and as he was leaving with the dog, another car pulled up and two men got out. They were Mark Brewer and Keith Muncy, detectives from the Sarasota Police Homicide Division who would now be taking lead on the case. The two detectives headed inside to join the deputies, who quickly brought them up to speed. Right away, they were struck by the brutality of Henry's murder. He'd been strangled to death with his own belt while he was sleeping, and he'd also been badly beaten. The sheer violence that must have been involved here gave this crime a very personal feeling. The detectives also noticed that while the bedroom had been ransacked, it didn't seem like anything had been taken. For example, Henry's wallet with some money and credit cards in it was just out on a dresser. And so this made the detectives think that this probably was not a robbery. Next, they checked the landline phone, which was still lying off the hook where Janet had dropped it. The line was dead, so Detective Muncy headed out to the backyard where he confirmed that the phone lines had been cut. He was heading back inside when a flash of white on the ground caught his eye. It was a cigarette butt, lying at the edge of the property. And while the grass was wet from some light rain earlier that night, this cigarette butt was dry, meaning it had been dropped within the last few hours. Muncy went inside to share this discovery with Detective Brewer, and after doing so, it would turn out Brewer also had some news of his own. He had found the fingertip of a latex glove in the bedroom. The detectives now had two pieces of evidence that might have the killer's fingerprints or DNA material on them. But the lab was backed up, and so testing these items would take time. And so they were hoping that long before they needed the results of those tests, their eyewitnesses could actually just help them solve the crime. So they headed to the hospital to interview the one person, aside from the killer, who was there when Henry was murdered, Janet. Unfortunately, though, when they arrived at the hospital, Janet was unconscious again. And also, one of the doctors warned that with the extent of the injuries she'd sustained, she could actually die. And so Brewer and Muncy were suddenly facing the possibility of a double murder. They asked the hospital staff to call them if Janet woke up. In the meantime, the detectives began digging into Henry's life to try and understand why someone had wanted to kill him. When they got access to his bank accounts, they were surprised by just how much money Henry had put away. Henry sort of gave off the vibe that he was a senior citizen on a limited fixed budget. But in reality, he had $700,000 in the bank. So the detectives speculated that maybe Henry was killed for his money. And their thoughts immediately turned toward Henry's relatives, who were most likely to gain financially from his death. The detectives learned that Henry did not have a will, but that only meant that the bulk of the inheritance would be divided between his adult children, Jeff and Sharon Kaniva. When the detectives reached out to Jeff and Sharon, they learned that they were actually already on their way to Sarasota after learning their father had been killed. And at the detectives' request, they agreed to stop by the station to answer some questions. Brewer and Muncy knew it was impossible for Jeff or Sharon to have been present for the murder, since they were across the country in California when it happened. But that did not stop them from potentially arranging a hit through a third party. The detectives pressed the siblings about how they got along with their father, and both Jeff and Sharon said they were on good terms with Henry, but they didn't really talk to him very much. Not because they didn't want to. Jeff clearly idolized his father and had even followed in his father's footsteps to become a car salesman. But they said their father liked his privacy and didn't want many visitors. He seemed happy with the new life he'd built in Florida, so they tried to give him space and let him be. But then Jeff dropped some truly shocking information. A few months earlier, he had called his father at home, and a young man had answered. When Jeff asked who he was talking to, the man said he was Henry's son. Jeff was initially stunned and very confused because he believed he was Henry's only son. But eventually, the truth came out. Soon after Henry had separated from Jeff and Sharon's mother and moved to Florida, he was in a very brief relationship with a woman who gave birth to Henry's other son, David. But Henry never told anybody about David, and Henry himself didn't even meet him until David had grown up and tracked him down. But from what Jeff was able to gather, it seemed like Henry and his son David had seen a lot of each other in the months leading up to the murder. It stung more than Jeff liked to admit, both because Henry had kept David's existence a secret and because he'd been so unavailable to his other kids. Following the conversation with Jeff and his sister Sharon, detectives Brewer and Muncy got to work tracking David down. They learned that he was 20 years old and lived about 3 hours away in the Daytona Beach area. When they contacted him, he agreed to come down to Sarasota for questioning. And during his interview, he admitted that he knew Henry had a lot of money, but didn't know how much or if Henry had a will. David confirmed that he had been spending more time with Henry recently, and that some of the visits had taken place at the house in Mirror Lake, where the murder took place. Most recently, David said he and Henry had watched sports together on TV on Father's Day, which happened to be just 4 days before Henry was killed. All these details made the detectives suspicious of David. After all those years without seeing his father, David was suddenly spending lots of time with him? Was he trying to get Henry's money? Did he secretly nurse a deep grudge against Henry? Either way, David did know his way around Henry's home, and also David was a big man who'd be quite physically capable of strangling a sleeping 76-year-old. David's alibi for the night of the murder was also pretty weak. David told the detectives that he was with his girlfriend that night, and while she did confirm that was true, Brewer and Muncie knew she could just be lying for him. So, ultimately, the detectives pressured David to take a polygraph test, and the results came back inconclusive. Now, of course, polygraph tests are not 100% accurate. I mean, people can lie and they can fake their answers, and a positive result could actually be a negative and vice versa. But at a minimum, an inconclusive test meant that David remained very much a potential suspect. The detectives were still interested in Henry's other 2 children as well, and Henry's funeral, held about a week after the murder, gave the detectives a chance to observe all 3 kids together. And right away, Brewer and Muncie could see there was almost palpable tension between David, Jeff, and Sharon. And also, they could overhear very testy conversations between the siblings. At one point, David commented that he was looking forward to buying jet skis with his inheritance. This did not go over well with Jeff, who was already feeling very jealous about Henry spending his last Father's Day with David instead of him, and so he got angry and accused David of being involved in the murder. David walked away before the argument could go any further, and for the remainder of the funeral, the siblings basically avoided each other. The detectives agreed it was not that surprising that the siblings didn't get along. However, them not getting along did not necessarily mean they killed their father. But regardless, Brewer and Muncie decided to still keep an eye on all of Henry's children while they simultaneously dug into his other relationships. The following day, the detectives headed to the Toyota dealership where Henry worked to interview some of his colleagues. And one of Henry's buddies, a guy named Red, was more than happy to help. Red said the other salesmen definitely respected Henry due to his long history in the business, but they also saw him as being pretty old-fashioned and would sometimes give him a hard time about being cheap. They couldn't understand why he wore old, ill-fitting clothes and drove a 10-year-old car when they knew he had money. It was common knowledge around the dealership that Henry had made more than the rest of them put together, just from the number of cars Henry had sold. As one salesman put it, Henry had, quote, more money than God. The detectives jotted all this down and then asked Red if there was anyone on the staff who might have wanted to harm Henry. Red thought for a moment and then told them they should go talk to a guy named Mark. Red explained that Mark was a younger salesman who had worked at the dealership until recently. He was argumentative and lazy and would often miss work, sometimes disappearing for as much as a week at a time. Mark's laziness really rubbed Henry the wrong way, and at one point he had tried to talk some sense into Mark, but Mark just sort of blew him off. And soon after that, Mark was abruptly fired, just a few days before Henry's murder. Now, Red didn't know if Henry had formally complained to management, which sort of led to Mark's firing, but Red said, Henry had been vocal enough about his dislike of Mark that most of the other employees assumed that Henry must have had something to do with Mark's firing. The detectives interviewed more of the salesmen and heard similar stories. Some people thought Mark was actually a drug addict, and that was why he disappeared sometimes. And a few of the salesmen recounted that Mark had been looking for a gun right around the time he got fired. He had told them he needed it to, quote, take care of something. Armed with all these stories, detectives Brewer and Muncie tracked down Mark and brought him into the Sarasota police station for questioning. Mark had a bad attitude right away, and acted annoyed at them for wasting his time. While Mark said he did not know anything about Henry's murder, he also said that yes, he and Henry had butted heads. He said that Henry wanted to be treated like the dealership king simply because he'd been there the longest. Mark said that Henry was always butting into other people's business, and as far as Mark was concerned, Henry had gotten what he deserved. Naturally, Brewer and Muncie found this kind of talk extremely suspicious, so they pressed Mark harder. They told him that they'd found a latex glove fragment at the crime scene with fingerprints on it. Now, this was a total bluff on their part. They'd already analyzed that glove fragment and it was clean of prints, but Mark didn't know that. And if he was guilty, thinking that the police had hard evidence could make him crack. But instead, Mark responded somewhat sarcastically, saying that, yeah, finding that glove at the scene would make me a good suspect because my sister is a nurse, and so I have access to gloves just like that. The detectives thought this was a very strange thing to say, even if it was sarcastic. I mean, Mark was technically incriminating himself in a murder investigation, but Mark just did not seem to care. Brewer and Muncie just sat there trying to make sense of what Mark had just said when they got a call from the hospital. Janet was awake, and it looked like she was going to survive. And while she was still weak and in a lot of pain, she had said she was ready to answer their questions. The detectives were so eager to hear from her that they let Mark go for the moment and raced over to the hospital. But when they finally sat down with Janet, it became clear she was not going to be as helpful as they'd hoped. Janet was not just beaten up, she was severely traumatized and confused about what had happened. Doctors said the first thing that she had asked when she regained consciousness was, "Where's Henry?" When Brewer and Muncie gently pressed her to try to focus and remember any details, she tried, but then suddenly got this crushing headache and had to stop. And then a couple of minutes later, when her headache kind of faded, she told them that all she could remember was being beaten and strangled by this faceless dark figure, and then a little bit after that, she remembered waking up on the ground, hearing this horrible rattling wheezing sound. To help jog her memory, Brewer showed Janet some crime scene photos of the bedroom that were taken after the attack. Janet looked closely at all the pictures, but still, she just could not remember anything else. However, she did notice something in one of the photos. Her 2 rings that she had placed on the nightstand were missing. And so at this point, the detectives knew that perhaps the stolen rings indicated that this was a robbery after all. Maybe the killer was planning to take more, but got spooked by the dogs barking and ran. But on the other hand, the fact that just these rings appeared to be missing and that they had sentimental value could point to a personal connection between the killer and the victims. As important as Janet's realization about the rings was, it didn't really provide the detectives with any new clear answers. Their investigation so far had turned up some strong suspects, including Mark, the shady car salesman, and the 3 Kaniva children, Jeff, Sharon, and their half-brother David, but as it stood, police did not have enough evidence to build a case against any one of them. So all the detectives could do now was just keep an eye on the suspects and hope that Janet's memory improved. But weeks and then months passed with no progress in the case or any change to Janet's memory, and so the investigation began to go cold. Then, in December of 1997, a full 6 months after Henry's murder, a clue dropped into the detectives' laps that changed everything. In a seemingly unrelated case, Sarasota police deputies responded to a domestic violence call at another house on Mirror Lake, across the water from Janet's place. This was not the first time they'd had to break up a fight at this home. A few months earlier, 39-year-old John Whiteley had pinned his girlfriend, 40-year-old Leela Hodges, between the washing machine and the wall, trapping her there. Leela had forgiven him for that incident, but now he'd attacked her again. And as the police once again separated the couple, John got the impression that he was about to be placed under arrest. And so he shouted that Leela had better keep her mouth shut and not accuse him of anything, or else he would tell them about the rings. Then, as if to prove he wasn't bluffing, he shouted to the deputies, "Hey, you guys want to know something about a murder?" Now, at this point, after John had said all this stuff, the deputies were all thinking of the same thing: Henry's murder case. Now, they all knew that 2 rings had been taken from the crime scene, but that detail had never been made public, which meant this couple, specifically John, might actually know something about Henry's murder. As soon as Detective Brewer and Muncie got word about John and Leela, they were convinced the couple must have had something to do with Henry's murder. They just couldn't figure out how John and Leela were connected to him. So, out of desperation, they decided to go back and talk to Janet one last time. Unfortunately, Janet still could not remember anything more about the attack. So, Brewer and Muncie came up with an idea. They were going to try to hypnotize her. It was unorthodox, but at this point, they were willing to try anything, and Janet was on board. So, the next day, the detectives returned, now with a hypnotist, who put Janet into a trance. And then while she was in her trance, they asked her a series of questions, designed to draw out her repressed memories from the attack. And suddenly, it was like Janet could hear and see things from the night of the attack that she hadn't been able to before. Finally, when the hypnotist asked her to describe her attacker, Janet grew quiet. She still could not picture their face, but she did remember something else. Under hypnosis, Janet recalled waking up to find a large, shadowy figure sitting on her thighs while violently grabbing her neck. Janet tried to fight, but it didn't do any good. Then, as the killer continued to throttle her, she became aware of another set of hands on her shoulders. A second person that she couldn't see was holding her to the ground. That meant there were 2 attackers in the bedroom that night, not just one. Janet's revelation stunned the detectives at first, but they quickly realized several of their suspects came in pairs. The first pair was Henry's first set of kids, Jeff and Sharon. They stood to benefit the most from Henry's death, as they knew they would inherit a portion of his small fortune. But that also applied to David, Jeff and Sharon's 20-year-old half-brother. David's girlfriend had provided him with an alibi. Now, the detectives wondered if maybe she'd help David commit the crime, thinking his inheritance would benefit her too, making David and her a pair. The third set of suspects was John and Leela, the couple from the domestic abuse call. While they didn't seem to have a motive, or even really a connection, they lived nearby and seemed to know information that was not shared with the public. The only suspect who did not come with a potential accomplice was Mark, the salesman who was fired days before the murder. While it was still possible that he had killed Henry over a grudge, or maybe as part of a robbery, the detective still had no idea who he would have worked with. That night, after leaving the hospital, Brewer and Muncie holed up in their office and read through the files for each set of suspects, searching for any detail they might have missed. And they were starting to lose steam when Muncie stumbled upon something that made him pause. It was a single word buried in one of the suspect's files. Muncie showed it to Brewer, who immediately jumped to his computer to pull up more details on that suspect. And as his screen filled with information, everything began to fall into place. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Henry Kaniva and Janet Scott on the night of June 20th, 1997. A little before 3 a.m., 2 figures crept along the bank of Mirror Lake. They were wearing black clothes and latex gloves, and the leader was smoking a cigarette. As they reached the edge of Janet's property, the leader put out the cigarette and dropped it into the wet grass. Then the pair hurried across the lawn to the house, where the leader used pliers to cut the phone line that was running along the exterior wall. They found the back door was unlocked, so they slipped inside. Once inside, the accomplice led the way to the master bedroom, where they found Henry and Janet fast asleep in bed. But the couple was not alone. Janet's dog, Kissy, was lying at her feet. When the killers entered, the dog jumped off the bed and began barking. The accomplice stepped forward and delivered a powerful kick that sent Kissy flying against the wall. She fell down and went limp. The killers quickly glanced back over at the bed, They were relieved to see that Janet and Henry were still asleep. So they moved ahead with their plan. The leader found a pair of pants on the floor, pulled out the leather belt, and then climbed on top of Henry. As Henry began to stir, the leader struck him several times in the face and then wrapped the belt around his neck and began to pull it tight. At the same time, the accomplice jumped on top of Janet and straddled her and began to beat her. Janet woke up and screamed and began fighting as hard as she could to get free, and one of Janet's wild punches caught the accomplice in the nose, causing them to reel back in surprise. And as a result, the accomplice and Janet both tumbled out of the bed onto the floor. By this point, the leader had finished with Henry, so they climbed off the bed and rushed around to help the accomplice. Together, they grabbed Janet and pinned her down, and then the leader climbed on top of her. Then the leader struck her several more times and then wrapped their hands around her neck and squeezed. The leader felt Janet go limp, at which point they said, "That should do it," as they climbed off of her. The killers looked at their handiwork and turned to go. On their way out, though, the accomplice spotted Janet's rings sitting on the nightstand, and they recognized one of the rings in an instant, and the sight of it made them furious. So, the accomplice impulsively grabbed both rings and stuffed them into their pocket, then turned and dashed out of the room along with the leader. The killers had only been gone a few minutes when Janet regained consciousness, feeling excruciating pain across her body. She could hear the strange, horrible rattling hiss and didn't know what it could be. Even as she lay there, her mind was already struggling to bury the horrible trauma she had just experienced. That's why she didn't remember until her hypnosis session that she'd actually been attacked by 2 people, and that one of them was actually somebody that she knew. It would turn out the killers were John Whiteley and Leila Hodges, the couple from the domestic abuse call. And just as Brewer and Muncie had suspected, these two did have a personal connection to the victims. However, the connection was not really to Henry, it was to Janet. When the detectives reviewed their case file, that single word that stuck out to them was Leila's maiden name. Leila had been married several times and had taken multiple last names, but she'd been born Leila Scott. She was no stranger to Janet. She was Janet Scott's stepdaughter. Leila was the daughter of Janet's late husband, Roe, from his first marriage. She grew up in the house on Mirror Lake where Janet and Henry lived together, and she hated them because she always thought that house should have gone to her when her dad died. Leila felt similarly about Janet's diamond ring. It was the same ring her father had given to his first wife, Leila's mother, which means, all along, the detectives were wrong about their most basic assumption. Henry was not the primary target of the attack. Janet was. And Leila's deep hatred of Janet explained the brutality of the attack. As a small older man, Henry didn't stand a chance, and Janet was lucky to be alive. She was beaten and choked so badly that her larynx was crushed. That horrible wheezing hiss she heard when she woke up on the floor, that was her own labored breathing. Once Detective Brewer and Muncie put this all together, they had John and Leila arrested. John's DNA was tested, and it matched the DNA found on the cigarette butt that was at the crime scene. The leader during the actual attack itself was John, and Leila was the accomplice. However, the true mastermind behind this attack was Leila. The couple took a plea deal and received a sentence of 20 years. As for Janet Scott, her physical and psychological trauma persisted for much longer than 20 years. Her voice and eyesight never completely returned to full strength. Fortunately, though, her beloved dog, Kissy, would make a full recovery and lived a long, happy life. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the Mr. Ballen podcast, And there's Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. One morning in 2012, a young man was looking out his backyard in West Virginia when he noticed something in his garden. So over the past couple of days, there had been really heavy rainfall, and it had basically turned his backyard into like a swamp. But in particular, in the garden in his backyard, there was almost like a sinkhole forming from all the water. And he noticed there was something in the hole, and it almost looked like it could be plastic. And so feeling curious, the young man left the house, and yeah, sure enough, there was what appeared to be the top of a plastic bag that had been tied up that was in this hole. And so he reached down and he pulled this bag out of the ground, and it was pretty heavy, and he opened it up and looked inside, and he dropped it and backed up in horror. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're over the Follow Button's house watching their favorite show together, be sure to constantly tap them on the shoulder and interrupt them in order to ask completely meaningless questions. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around noon on Saturday, April 24th, 2010, a 64-year-old sales clerk named Kathy Goebel grabbed a suit jacket off the rack at a high-end men's store in Charleston, West Virginia. She carried it over to a customer, and then she helped him put it on in front of the mirror. And after he was dressed, the man smiled at his reflection and said it looked great. So Kathy had worked at the store now for 10 years, and she really loved working there. I mean, everything about it was great. The staff was like family, she herself was very people-oriented and was great at building relationships with customers. In fact, she was so good at, building relationships that men from all over town would come to the store specifically to see Kathy when they needed a new suit. However, this man she was currently helping wasn't like all the other customers. His name was Dr. Harry King, and he was a radiologist, and he had been a regular at the store for many years. And even though he was married, and even though Kathy herself was in a long-term relationship, these two were actually having an affair. Harry had a lot of money, and he really enjoyed showering Kathy with expensive gifts. In fact, he had even paid to have her kitchen redone. And just a couple of weeks ago, he'd taken her on a trip across the country to San Francisco. Now, when Kathy went on that trip, she had told her longtime boyfriend, Fred Farrell, that it was actually just a girls' trip to visit an old friend. And even though she did feel bad about lying to him, Kathy really didn't know how long her relationship with Fred was going to last anyway, so it sort of seemed like maybe it's not worth trying to protect it. Kathy and Fred had been dating for about 2 years, and Fred was definitely a nice guy, but recently he had asked Kathy to marry him, and she definitely was not sure about that and told him, I don't know, I have to think about it. So the big reason why Kathy was definitely on the fence about marriage in general was actually because Kathy had been divorced twice already. She also liked having her own house and her own life and not being tied to just one man. But she couldn't bring herself to actually break up with Fred when he proposed, and so she was sort of in this holding period now. And she figured that, as long as her affair with Harry stayed a secret, nobody would get hurt. So Kathy carried Harry's new suit over to the cash register, and as she rang it up, Harry leaned over the counter and asked if she wanted to go grab lunch. And Kathy smiled and said, sure. About an hour later, Kathy came back to the store after her lunch break, and inside she saw there was a young woman standing at the back of the store by a rack of shirts. The woman's clothes were a bit ragged, and she looked out of place, like she wasn't the typical clientele for the store. And as Kathy got closer to her, she realized it was her coworker's daughter, Jessica Fisher. And Jessica really put Kathy on edge, because Jessica had a drug problem. And every once in a while, she would come into the store and she would ask Kathy for some of Kathy's Xanax. And Kathy felt bad for her, so even though she knew it was a bad idea and it was wrong to do this, she usually would give Jessica some of her Xanax. But today, Jessica looked so sick and so agitated that Kathy really had to face the truth here. Jessica had a serious addiction and she really had to stop enabling it. So when Jessica invariably asked Kathy if she had any pills on her, Kathy put her foot down and said no. And Jessica did not take that well. She started screaming at Kathy. It caused this huge scene. There were other customers inside looking over. And at some point, Kathy's manager came running over to see what was going on. Eventually, Jessica did sort of give up and she ran out of the store. But the whole encounter really left Kathy feeling shaken up. And for the rest of her shift, it was all she could think about. That night, just after the men's store closed at 5 p.m., Kathy came out the front door accompanied by one of her male coworkers. She was afraid that Jessica might be out here waiting to confront her. And so she had asked one of the other shoe salesmen, a guy named Charles March, to just walk her to her car. And so now, the two of them, Charles and Kathy, as they exited the store and made their way across the lot, they both were sort of on high alert, waiting to see if Jessica was going to pop out somewhere. But Kathy didn't see Jessica or anybody else lurking around, so eventually she got to her SUV, she said goodnight to Charles, and then she climbed into her car. Once inside the car, she locked all the doors and then exhaled in relief. She felt safe. And then as she started the engine, she called her longtime boyfriend, Fred. Fred was actually out of town on a fishing trip, and when he answered, Kathy told him that she was going to stop by his apartment that night and just clean it up for him before he came home. Now, Fred told her that she really didn't have to do that, but she insisted. She said she would head over there later that night, and then she hung up. But before she went to Fred's, Kathy actually planned to make another stop at the home of her ex-husband, or one of her ex-husbands, David McCartney. So Kathy and David had been divorced for 20 years now, but they had had 2 kids together, so they stayed in touch. A few years ago, David had actually had a stroke, and while he survived the stroke, his health still never fully recovered. And he wasn't remarried and didn't have anybody taking care of him, so Kathy would often stop by to help him out whenever she could. And so that was her plan for tonight, to just swing by, see if he was doing okay. So after hanging up with Fred and putting her phone in her purse, she threw her car in gear and she drove off towards David's house. A few hours later, around 8:30 p.m., Kathy was chatting on the phone with her friend Laura while she drove toward her boyfriend Fred's apartment. She had just been at David's house and she had helped him with some chores, and then after she had left, she had swung by Walmart to pick up some food and cleaning supplies, and now she was telling Laura that she was actually sort of looking forward to cleaning up Fred's apartment and then just having some alone time, that night afterwards. Kathy eventually reached Fred's apartment, and so she parked her SUV in the driveway, and she's still on the phone with Laura, and she walked up towards Fred's apartment. But as she was unlocking the door, she looked and noticed there was someone walking towards her. And so she told Laura that she had to go, then she hung up, and she pushed the apartment door open. 2 days later, on the morning of Monday, April 26th, Kathy Goebel's 36-year-old son, Jason McCartney, knocked on the door of her house, which was located on a quiet suburban road. That morning, Jason had gotten a call from Kathy's boss saying that she hadn't come into work, and she also wasn't answering her phone, which just was not like her. Jason had tried calling his mother too, but she hadn't answered him either. So now he was at her house to make sure she was okay. But no one was answering the door. So Jason pulled out his own key and he let himself inside. And then once he was inside, he began walking all around, calling out for his mom, searching every room, but there was no sign of her. She wasn't there. And there was no sign of her purse, which she brought with her everywhere. And then when he went into the garage, he saw that her SUV was also missing. So at this point, Jason pulled out his phone and he called his mother's boyfriend, Fred, to see if maybe she was with him. But Fred said no. And in fact, he said he hadn't heard from her since Saturday evening. Fred said he'd gotten home the day before on Sunday from his fishing trip, but when he got home, he'd found Kathy's cell phone, her spare car keys, and her medication just sitting on his kitchen counter. But Kathy herself was not there, and also neither was her car. And so at this point, Jason had a really bad feeling that something wasn't right here, but he knew who to call, his childhood friend, Detective Brian Carper of the Kanawha County Sheriff's Department. Later that morning, Detective Carper walked up to the door of Fred Farrell's apartment, which was on the other side of town from Kathy's house. Carper had spoken to Jason, and he had found out that his mother had left her belongings here at Fred's apartment on Saturday night, and no one had heard from her in the 40 hours since then. Also, her silver Honda SUV was nowhere to be found. So Carper had been friends with Jason for decades, and in that time, not only did he become close, obviously, with Jason, but also with Jason's mom. So because he knew Kathy fairly well, he knew this whole situation was just very out of character for her. And so right away, he's thinking, this has got to be something serious. And so with a sense of urgency, Carper knocked on Fred's apartment door, and a few seconds later, a spry, active-looking man in his mid-70s answered the door, and he invited Carper inside, and they sat down at the kitchen table. Carper began by asking Fred when was the last time he had spoken to Kathy. And he told him that Kathy had called him on Saturday night while he was off on a fishing trip, and that she had told him that she was going to go over to his apartment while he was away and clean it for him so that when he got home, it would be, nice and tidy. And when Carper looked around the apartment he was in, he did notice that it was clean. In fact, it was like spotless, as if the entire apartment had been scrubbed top to bottom. But Carper didn't call attention to that. Instead, he just told Fred to go on. And so Fred said that when he'd come home from the fishing trip on Sunday, so the day before, Kathy hadn't been there. But several lights in his apartment had been left on, a window was open, and some of Kathy's things had been left out on the counter. And also, the apartment was clearly very clean, so it seemed like she had been here at least for a while, but she was not there anymore. And so Carper glanced over at Fred's counter, and he did see there was a phone, a pill bottle, and a set of spare car keys that clearly belonged to Kathy. And Carper, he turned back to Fred and he said, did it strike you as odd that she was gone but left behind these really important items? And Fred just said, no, it actually wasn't odd, that Kathy was sometimes quite forgetful. However, when Fred said this, he distinctly looked away from Carper, like he wasn't meeting him eye to eye when he said that Kathy was forgetful. And so Carper began to think that Fred seemed pretty nervous. And it also definitely had not escaped him that Fred had also just referred to Kathy in the past tense, that she was forgetful, not that she is forgetful. Almost like he already knew that she might be dead, even though at this point she was only missing. And so to Carper, all of this seemed really suspicious. So he told Fred that he would have to come down to the station right now for additional questioning. Fred agreed to it, and as the men stood up from the table and headed for the door, Carper grabbed Kathy's car keys off the counter and put them in his pocket. Later that afternoon, back at the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office, Detective Carper looked over a copy of Kathy's phone records. By this point in the day, they'd already interrogated Fred, but he was sticking to a story about the fishing trip. Carper had also gone to the men's store where Kathy worked and had spoken to her coworkers, but none of them had any clue where Kathy could have gone. One of the shoe salesmen confirmed that he had walked Kathy out to the parking lot around 5 p.m. on Saturday, and he had watched her drive away, but that was the last time any of them had seen or heard from her. But now, as Carper scanned the list of calls that Kathy had made and received that Saturday, he saw that after she had left work that night, she had answered 2 incoming calls. One was from a woman named Laura Henderson, and the other was from her ex-husband, David McCartney. And so Carper wrote down both their names and then looked up their addresses. He was hoping that one of them could help fill in the gaps of what Kathy had done after work that night. A short while later, Detective Carper was sitting in the living room of Kathy's ex-husband, David McCartney. And David told the detective that he had heard about Kathy's disappearance from their son, Jason, and he was shocked to hear about it because he'd actually seen Kathy on the night she vanished. He told Carper that on Saturday, after Kathy had gotten off of work, she had come over to his house. And when she was there, she had helped him pay some bills that he had forgotten about, in part because his memory was not that great ever since his stroke. But he said Kathy hadn't really stayed very long at his house before she said she just had to leave, and then she had gone. And Carper really didn't know what to make of this, because now it was clear that David, at least so far, was the last person to have seen Kathy in person. But Carper really wasn't seeing a motive here. I mean, if anything, all he was seeing is that David felt an enormous amount of appreciation and gratitude toward his ex-wife. And then on top of that, David was not exactly young, and also he had some pretty serious mobility issues from the stroke he had had. And so Carper really wasn't even sure that somebody in David's condition would be able to hurt or kidnap Kathy, even if he had really wanted to. And also, Carper had to remind himself that he still wasn't even sure if anyone had hurt or kidnapped Kathy. After all, it's only been a couple of days now, and it was entirely possible that maybe she was safe somewhere and she would turn up and that this was just a big misunderstanding. However, there was still one more person that Carper really wanted to follow up with before he drew any initial conclusions. And that was the last person on Kathy's call records, Laura Henderson. And so later that same day, Carper sat down across from Laura Henderson in her living room. And Laura seemed really upset when Carper told her that she may have been the last person to speak to Kathy before she disappeared. At some point, he asked Laura whether Kathy had said anything on that last phone call about what she was up to that night, or if she had had any recent issues with anyone, or, anything odd. And Laura, she shook her head and said no, but then she stopped and she said, well, actually, there was one thing about that call that had stuck out to her as being a little bit strange. She said the last thing Kathy had said before hanging up was, we're going into Fred's apartment. Not, I'm going into Fred's apartment, but we're going into Fred's apartment. We, like she was with someone. Carper was sort of surprised by this because his understanding is that Kathy had gone to Fred's apartment to clean it by herself based on what she had sort of communicated to Fred. And so he asked Laura if she had any idea who this other person was that she could have been with. And Laura said no. She said that Kathy had made no mention of there being another person with her on the entire call. In fact, the first mention of there being this other person was basically right at the end of the call when she had hung up. She basically had said to Laura, we're going in, and then she had hung up. And so Carper spoke with Laura for a few more minutes, and then shortly after he left her house, his cell phone rang. And when he answered it, it was an officer on the line who said he had found Kathy's SUV. It had been abandoned on the highway about 15 miles outside of town. And Carper said he would be there right away. Later that same Monday afternoon, so we're still just 48 hours after the last time anyone had seen or heard from Kathy, Carper parked on the side of the highway in a wooded area outside of Charleston. And through his windshield, he saw a silver Honda SUV parked a few yards ahead of him, right next to an exit. And right away, he recognized the license plate as being Kathy's. And so Carper got out of his car, and as he approached Kathy's SUV, he saw there was a white towel hanging out of the driver's side window, which was normally a signal that a car had broken down. All the doors were locked, so Carper pulled Kathy's spare key that he had grabbed out of Fred's apartment out of his pocket, and he used it to unlock the driver's side door. There was nobody inside the car, and there was no sign of a struggle, there was no blood anywhere, and also Kathy's purse was not inside either. So Carper had to wonder if maybe Kathy had been driving along this road and then her car, ran into some trouble and she walked off to get help when nobody had stopped. However, just to make sure, Carper sat in the driver's seat and he used his spare key and he tried the engine just to see if it would work. And as soon as he turned the key, the car started. The car was running just fine. And he also saw there was a half a tank of gas left. So at first glance, it appeared like, this didn't really make any sense. Why is this car abandoned here with the white towel in the window signifying that this car has broken down when the car works just fine or appears to work just fine? And so Carper, at this point, he began to think this is a sign that Kathy likely had not disappeared by choice here. There was just no good reason why she would have driven 15 miles out of town without her phone in the middle of the night, tell no one, abandon her car on the side of the highway, and just walk off. Why would she do that? And so to Carper, it seemed like the most plausible explanation here was that Kathy had been abducted. And whoever had done it also dumped her car out here with the towel in the window just to throw off investigators. Two days later, on the morning of April 28, 2010, Detective Carper walked into the men's clothing store where Kathy worked. Now, by this point, he had already spoken to Kathy's coworkers once on the day that she was reported missing. But now that he had learned from Laura that there was apparently someone else with her on Saturday night, he now really wanted to question everybody again to see if they had any idea who this other person might have been. So he tracked down Kathy's manager and he asked her if he could speak to her and ask her a few more questions. And she said sure. And she led him over to a quiet part of the store where the customers wouldn't hear them. And so Carper, he pulled out his notepad and he asked her, the manager, to walk through what Kathy did during her final shift and be as detailed as possible. The manager said it had been a pretty normal day. Kathy had come in around 9 a.m. and helped out a few customers. The only thing that stuck out to her was that at some point in the afternoon, another coworker's daughter had come into the store, and Kathy and this daughter had gotten into a really big argument, like a very public, nasty argument. Now, the manager said she really had no idea what the fight was even about, but just if they wanted to follow up, the daughter's name was Jessica Fisher. And so Carper, he wrote down Jessica's name and made a note to look into her. After that, he asked the manager if she had seen Kathy interact with basically anybody else that day, like any other meaningful interaction that he should know about. And the manager thought for a second and said, actually, yes, there was someone. She said that Kathy had gone out to lunch with a friend who also happened to be a regular customer at the store. She said his name was Dr. Harry King. Later that same day, Carper sat down inside of an interrogation room with Harry King, and Harry seemed really nervous. When Carper asked if he knew why he was there, Harry said yes. Harry then put his head in his hands and he said, I know I should have come in sooner, but I was just afraid of what was going to happen. He explained that he and Kathy were not just friends. They were having an affair. He said they'd even gone on a trip to San Francisco together a couple of weeks ago, and they'd both lied to their respective partners about it. Carper was really surprised by this, and right away he wondered if maybe Kathy's boyfriend, Fred, had found out about the affair and killed Kathy out of jealousy. Or maybe things had gone bad between Harry and Kathy, their affair had gone south, and Harry had killed her. It did seem really suspicious that Harry clearly knew Kathy was missing, but hadn't come forward to the police. He had to be asked to come in. So Carper asked Harry to just go ahead and explain where he had been on Saturday night. And Harry said he'd been at home all night with his wife. And so Carper asked if he could speak to Harry's wife to verify his alibi. And immediately Harry pleaded with the detective not to bring his wife into this, doesn't want to give up that he's having an affair here. But eventually he seemed to understand that without an alibi, he was the primary suspect here. So he agreed and gave Carper his wife's phone number. A few days later, on May 1st, so a week after Kathy was last seen and she's still missing, Carper walked up the steps of a cheap motel on the edge of town. He'd finally tracked down Jessica Fisher, the co-worker's daughter who had gotten into a fight with Kathy at the men's clothing store on the day she disappeared. And this motel was apparently where she was staying. And so Carper figured out which room was Jessica's, and then he knocked on the door. And then a moment later, the door opened, and there was Jessica. And Jessica did not look well. She was unbelievably skinny, like gaunt skinny. She looked sick. In fact, Carper basically assumed that based on her physical appearance, she very likely was struggling with addiction. And so Carper, after introducing himself and confirming that this was in fact Jessica Fisher, he explained to her why he was there. He said that Kathy Goebel is missing, and we know you got into a fight with her on the day she vanished at the store where she works. And so he asked her to explain what the fight was about. After hearing all this, Jessica's eyes went wide, and she insisted that she had no idea what had happened to Kathy. And when Carper pressed her again about why they had fought in the store that day, Jessica was kind of evasive at first, but then finally she just broke down, and she admitted that she had been asking Kathy for drugs, and Kathy had said no, and they had fought about it. She said that sometimes Kathy would give her Xanax, but that day, Kathy had refused. So Jessica said she got mad and sort of freaked out, and that was the fight. But Jessica swore that once another worker had intervened, she had just left the store and gone home and never seen Kathy again. Like that really was all it was. Now, Carper's reaction to this is, it sounded an awful lot like Jessica was telling the truth. But he still asked her if she would take a polygraph test, just to be sure. And she said yes, of course. And so Carper gave her his business card, and they agreed on a date and time for her to come into the station for that test. But when that date and time rolled around, Jessica never showed up. In May of 2010, so a couple of weeks after Kathy Goebel disappeared, Detective Brian Carper was looking through a forensics report at his desk. Kathy's car that had been found on the side of the highway had been processed for evidence. But as this report showed, no DNA or fingerprints had been found inside or on it from anyone other than Kathy. Now, this didn't mean that, someone could not have dumped Kathy's car on the side of the road. It just meant that if that happened, whoever did it was very careful to cover their tracks. and forensic evidence was not going to help pin them down. And this was very frustrating for Carper, because so far, all his leads were sort of coming up dry. Dr. Harry King's wife had confirmed his alibi, and when Carper had spoken to her, she had seemed very upset to learn that her husband was having an affair. So Carper didn't think she would want to lie for him. She probably was telling the truth, that he really was there with her. Carper had questioned Kathy's 2 adult sons, Jason and Paul, but they both came in and passed polygraph tests and were ruled out as suspects. As for Jessica Fisher, the young woman who had gotten into a fight with Kathy in the store over Kathy not giving her Xanax pills, well, she had agreed to come in and take a polygraph, but she hadn't shown up, and currently she was still MIA. And even though Kathy's boyfriend, Fred, and ex-husband, David, both still seemed pretty suspicious, there really was nothing concrete tying them to Kathy's disappearance. And so as the weeks passed by, Carper just had no idea what happened to Kathy. There hadn't been any activity on her bank accounts or credit cards since the day she vanished, so it seemed pretty clear that she had not just run off, because you'd see transactions. However, it probably meant then that she was being held captive or something, or maybe she was dead, but Carper just didn't know. And so this was a pretty unusual case, because Carper did have several pretty solid suspects, but no actual evidence that a crime had even been committed. And so unless Kathy was found, dead or alive, or some new evidence was uncovered, it would be impossible to charge anyone in connection with her disappearance. And so as weeks turned to months and Kathy just continued not to turn up, the case ultimately went cold. 2 years later, on April 25th, 2012, Detective Carper trudged through the mud and puddles in the parking lot of the police station and then wiped his shoes on the mat outside the front door. It had been raining for days now, and the rivers and the creeks around Charleston had all flooded, and the whole city was basically a swampy mess. As Carper walked to his office, an officer suddenly ran up to him and said that a 911 call had just come in, and Carper would definitely want to hear about it. The officer said that according to this caller, all the rain they had been having had unearthed a human body that clearly had been buried at some point on the edge of town. And as he explained where this body had been found, Carper's heart began to race. He understood why the officer had brought this to him specifically, because that body had to be Kathy Goebel. Based on the place of burial and other forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Kathy Goebel on the night of April 24th, 2010. Around 8:30 p.m., the killer was waiting outside of Fred's apartment. They knew Kathy would be coming by that night, and soon they saw the headlights of her SUV coming up the street. As Kathy got out of her car with a plastic grocery bag and a phone to her ear, the killer approached the doorstep and waved. And Kathy, who was still on the phone, she sort of seemed surprised to see the killer, but nonetheless, she continued talking on the phone, and she didn't say anything to the killer as she just continued to unlock the door, open it up, and sort of gestured for the killer to come on in with them. Once inside, Kathy set the shopping bag and a few of her other things down on the counter, and then once she'd hung up the phone, she asked the killer what were they doing there, and the killer just asked her if she would take a drive somewhere with them. And Kathy seemed a little confused by the request, but said okay. The killer waited for a few minutes while Kathy cleaned up the apartment, because that was something she said that she wanted to do. And then once she was done, they both left the apartment, they got in the killer's car, and the killer drove them to another house way out on the edge of town. And once they were there, they went inside, and the killer asked Kathy if she wanted to have sex with them. And Kathy said no. And this rejection sent the killer into like an instant rage. And they grabbed her, they tied her up, and they strangled her. And then when she stopped moving, they dragged her lifeless body into a bathtub, and they grabbed a saw and they cut off her arms, her legs, and her head. Then they took her severed body parts and they buried her in a shallow grave in their backyard. But 2 years later, the killer's son noticed something in their backyard after all this heavy rain, and when he went out there to see what was in the middle of the yard, he found her body. The shoe salesman, Charles March, who ironically had been the one to walk Kathy out to her car on the day she vanished to keep her safe from Jessica Fisher after that fight. He was the person that she trusted to keep her safe. He was her killer. It would turn out Charles, who at no point was even considered as a suspect in this case, actually had a history of stalking women, and investigators believe he'd grown obsessed with Kathy while working with her, and then he eventually killed her when she rejected his advances. Charles March was arrested on April 25, 2012, and charged with Kathy's murder. He pled guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. However, he died of cancer in prison just 2 years later in 2014. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballen podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.